Hey guys, tonight we're stepping straight into a winter you probably won't survive this. Not because of gunfights or outlaw ambushes, but because the cold doesn't care who you are. It doesn't negotiate, it just waits. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop your city and the time you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the open range as daylight drains out of the sky, and the temperature is falling faster than you expected. The sun doesn't set gently out here, it vanishes. One moment the land glows amber, the next it's steel blue and bitter. Your breath clouds instantly. Somewhere behind you, cattle shift and snort, uneasy. This is the moment every cowboy fears, even if he never says it out loud. Winter, arriving unannounced and unforgiving. The myth says cowboys feared bullets and bad men. The reality is colder. Exposure killed far more cowboys than violence ever did. That's a historical fact most dime novels skipped. Hypothermia, frostbite, and simple exhaustion were the true outlaws of the Old West. And right now, as the wind begins to push against your coat, you understand why shelter isn't comfort. It's survival. You look around, scanning the land the way cowboys learned to do without realizing they were learning. The terrain speaks quietly if you know how to listen. A shallow draw might block the wind. A cluster of cottonwoods could mean less exposure. A low hill might break the worst of the gusts. Cowboys didn't have blueprints or plans. They had instinct, experience, and whatever daylight remained. The cold front rolls in like a living thing. Wind slices through fabric, finds every weak seam, every careless gap. Your fingers sting first, then ache, then feel oddly numb. That numbness is dangerous. Cowboys knew that once feeling faded, mistakes followed fast. The priority becomes simple. Build something, anything that slows the wind. This is where the story of cowboy shelters really begins. Not with cabins or homesteads, but with desperation. A few branches dragged together, sagebrush piled into a low wall, a wagon tipped just right to block the worst direction of the wind. These weren't structures meant to last. They were meant to last the night. There's a quirky detail historians love to mention. Some cowboys slept standing up against their horses during sudden cold snaps. The animal's body heat and bulk blocked wind when nothing else was available. It sounds absurd now, but in a pinch, it worked. Horses were living windbreaks, warm and stubbornly solid. The Old West was full of these improvised solutions that blur the line between ingenuity and madness. As darkness settles, the land goes quiet in a way that feels heavy. Sound travels differently in cold air. Every step crunches louder. Every breath feels intrusive. Cowboys described winter nights as mentally exhausting, not just physically brutal. The shelter you build doesn't just protect your body, it steadies your mind. Walls, even flimsy ones, give the illusion of control in a world that has stripped most of it away. There's an ongoing debate among historians about whether cowboys preferred temporary shelters or simply pushed on to establish line camps whenever possible. Some argue the open-range culture valued mobility over comfort, making quick, disposable shelters the norm. Others point to journals suggesting cowboys went to great lengths to reinforce winter camps when they knew storms were coming. The truth likely sits somewhere in between, shaped by weather, experience, and sheer luck. You crouch behind your growing windbreak, hands clumsy but determined. Each branch you add feels like a small victory. The wind dulls just a little, enough to matter, enough to give you a fighting chance. Cowboys didn't talk about hope much, but this is what it looked like. Small improvements stacked against overwhelming odds. As the night deepens, stars burn cold and sharp overhead. The sky is clear now, which is almost worse. Clear skies often mean colder temperatures. A cowboy would know that instinctively, even if he couldn't explain the science behind radiational cooling. Another historical fact: some of the deadliest cold snaps came with beautiful cloudless skies. Beauty, out here, was often a warning. You pull your coat tighter and settle in, back pressed to the rough shelter. It creaks softly as the wind tests it. Somewhere far off, a wolf howls. Not close enough to threaten, but close enough to remind you how small you are. Cowboys learned early that winter stripped life down to essentials: warmth, shelter, endurance. Tonight isn't about heroics. It's about staying alive until morning. The shelters cowboys built weren't symbols of conquest over nature. They were admissions of vulnerability, quiet agreements with the land that said, "Let me stay just a little longer." As you close your eyes, listening to the wind comb through grass and brush, you realize this is where the real Old West begins. Not in gun smoke, but in cold silence, and the fragile walls men raised against it. Morning doesn't arrive gently. You wake because the cold decides you should. Your body feels stiff, like it belongs to the ground instead of you, and for a moment you don't remember where you are. Then the wind slides along the shelter wall and memory snaps back into place. This is winter on the range, and it isn't finished with you yet. Cowboys used to say the night was only half the battle. The other half was realizing you survived it. As you sit up, you notice how thin your shelter really is. In daylight, everything looks smaller, weaker, more temporary. That's the first lesson winter teaches. What felt adequate at dusk can look laughable by sunrise. Cowboys learned quickly that surviving one night didn't mean you were safe. Cold compounded, fatigue stacked. A bad shelter choice today could kill you tomorrow. This is why winter, not violence, was the real enemy of the cowboy. Historical records from cattle outfits and trail bosses show that accidents and exposure far outnumbered deaths from gunfights. The romantic West loved conflict, but the working West feared weather. Men froze during cattle drives, lost fingers to frostbite while repairing tack, or simply fell asleep and never woke up. Shelter wasn't optional, it was strategy. You start walking, warming yourself through movement, scanning the land with new urgency. Cowboys became amateur meteorologists without ever meaning to. They watched clouds, felt shifts in wind direction, read snow texture underfoot. A crusted surface meant colder nights ahead. Powdery snow meant insulation if you used it right. These details guided decisions about where and how to build shelter long before any structure went up. The smartest cowboys didn't fight the land, they folded into it. Low ground wasn't always bad if it blocked wind. A shallow ravine could be warmer than a hilltop by 10 degrees or more. Trees weren't just firewood, they were windbreaks, anchors, and roofs. Cowboys knew that shelter started with placement, not construction. A poorly placed cabin could be colder than a well-chosen hollow with nothing but brush. There's a strange, almost counterintuitive trick that shows up in several cowboy journals. Some men deliberately chose leeward snowdrifts to bed down against, carving shallow depressions into packed snow. Snow, despite its reputation, is an excellent insulator. That's the quirky fact modern readers struggle with. Cowboys noticed that snow blocked wind better than bare ground. Used correctly, it could save your life. Used wrong, it could bury you. You kneel and press your glove into a drift, feeling how firm it is beneath the crust. This is information. Everything becomes information in winter. The land is constantly telling you how close you are to danger. Cowboys who ignored these signals didn't last long. The ones who did often survived on knowledge passed quietly between men, not written down, rarely bragged about. There's debate among historians over how formalized this knowledge really was. Some argue cowboy winter survival skills were crude and inconsistent, learned through hard personal experience rather than shared systems. Others point to repeated patterns across regions, similar shelter designs, fire placement habits, and terrain choices, as evidence of a shared, evolving survival culture. You can feel that debate in your own hands as you work. Are you improvising, or following a tradition you didn't know you inherited? As the day stretches on, you rebuild and reinforce. This time you angle the wall lower, tighter to the ground. Wind flows like water. It slips over high edges but slams into low barriers. Cowboys learned that tall shelters invited collapse. Low ones endured. Pride had no place in winter architecture. Survival demanded humility. Fire becomes the next calculation. Too big, and you burn precious fuel and risk sparks. Too small, and it mocks you with warmth you can't quite reach. Cowboys often built fires outside shelters, using reflective walls of stone, earth, or even stacked saddles to bounce heat inward. It's another historical fact that many winter camps avoided indoor fires altogether because of smoke buildup and oxygen loss. Carbon monoxide poisoning wasn't understood, but its effects were. There's a fringe story that circulates in Western lore about cowboys heating rocks in a fire and rolling them into bedrolls to stay warm through the night. Some historians question how widespread this was, but the idea appears often enough to suggest it happened. You can imagine it now, stones wrapped in cloth, radiating warmth for a few precious hours. Risky, yes, but winter was full of risky choices. By afternoon, clouds begin to gather, not the dramatic kind, thin, high and quiet. You know enough now to be uneasy. Cowboys feared sudden whiteouts more than steady storms. Visibility vanished, landmarks disappeared, men walked in circles until exhaustion took them. Shelter, once built, became an anchor point. Leaving it during a storm could be fatal. You tighten the shelter again, feeling the rhythm of preparation settle your nerves. There's something calming about repetition in dangerous conditions. Cowboys often described winter work as strangely meditative. When survival depends on simple tasks done correctly, the mind narrows its focus. Fear gets quieter, not because it's gone, but because it's busy being useful. As evening approaches, you notice how the light changes faster than it should. The sun slips behind cloud cover early, and temperature follows it down. This is the pattern that haunted trail bosses, the kind that preceded disasters like the Great Die-Up of 1886–87, when brutal winters killed hundreds of thousands of cattle and countless men. That event reshaped ranching forever, forcing the end of open-range grazing in many areas. Winter didn't just test shelters, it changed history. You settle in as darkness returns, more prepared than last night, but not confident. Cowboys learned never to trust winter completely. Confidence bred carelessness, and carelessness killed. You listen again to the wind, to the subtle shift in its tone as it meets your shelter. It's working. Not perfectly, but enough. As you lie back staring at the dark ceiling of branches and sky, you realize something important. Cowboy shelters weren't monuments. They weren't meant to be remembered. They were meant to disappear, just like their builders often did. And yet, in their quiet effectiveness, they tell the truest story of the Old West. A story not of conquest, but of endurance. You wake again before dawn, not because you're rested, but because the cold has shifted. It presses from a different angle now, sneaking in where last night's defences felt solid. That's how winter works. It adapts. Cowboys learned that shelters were never finished, only negotiated. Each hour demanded attention, adjustment and respect for forces far larger than one tired body. As the sky lightens, you step outside and immediately feel how exposed the land really is. The horizon stretches unbroken, a reminder that trees and rocks are luxuries out here, not guarantees. On the open plains, the hardest part of building shelter was simply finding something to build with. Wood didn't grow conveniently where cattle grazed best. That mismatch shaped nearly every winter survival choice cowboys made. This is where reading the land became a survival skill equal to riding or roping. Cowboys searched for subtle dips, shallow cuts left by ancient water flows, or the downwind side of long, low ridges. These weren't dramatic hiding places. They were barely their advantages, but winter made small advantages enormous. A drop of just a few feet could mean escaping the full force of a prairie gale. You walk slowly, eyes down, noticing how snow gathers unevenly. Where it piles higher, the wind is weaker. Where grass pokes through, the ground radiates more heat during the day. Cowboys used these clues instinctively. One historical fact buried in trail journals is that many winter camps were chosen not for proximity to water, but for wind protection first. Thirst could be managed, wind could not. You settle on a new spot, slightly lower, slightly calmer. It doesn't look impressive, but you've learned not to judge shelters by appearances. Cowboys built for function, not pride. The first task is clearing snow down to firm ground. Bare earth absorbs daytime heat and releases it slowly at night. A subtle but meaningful advantage. It's the kind of detail you only appreciate when the temperature drops below survival margins. Brush becomes your primary material again, Sage, greasewood, whatever the land offers. You stack it densely, overlapping pieces to trap air. Air, when trapped, becomes warmth. This principle wasn't scientific knowledge to cowboys, but experiential truth. Loose walls let wind steal heat. Tight walls held it hostage. Many men learned this the hard way, waking up with frost lining the inside of their shelters. There's a curious detail archaeologists still puzzle over. Some temporary cowboy shelters show signs of intentional collapse after use. Walls pushed inward, roofs dragged down. One theory suggests cowboys dismantled shelters to prevent others from relying on unsafe structures later. Another argues they did it to reclaim materials. A third suggests it was superstition, leaving nothing behind that winter could claim. The debate remains unresolved, but standing here, you understand the impulse. Winter feels personal. As you work, the wind rises again, carrying fine snow that stings exposed skin. You angle the shelter's opening away from it, narrowing the entrance until it's barely wide enough to crawl through. Cowboys learned that doors were liabilities. Openings were necessary evils. The smaller, the better. Some shelters had no true entrance at all, just a low gap sealed with blankets or hides once inside. Buffalo hides, when available, were prized beyond measure. Thick, heavy, and nearly windproof, they transformed flimsy structures into survivable spaces. This is another historical fact. Hides were often used as building materials long after the meat was eaten and the bones discarded. Waste was a luxury winter did not permit. Every part of the animal became shelter, clothing, or fuel. There's a fringe belief recorded in a few frontier accounts that buffalo hides retained a kind of animal warmth, even after curing. Scientifically, that's nonsense, but psychologically it mattered. Cowboys wrapped themselves in hides and felt safer, steadier. In winter, belief could be as powerful as insulation. A calmer mind made better decisions, and better decisions meant survival. By midday, clouds thicken and light flattens, erasing shadows. Depth perception fades, and the world feels oddly two-dimensional. Cowboys dreaded this light. It made distances deceptive and movement exhausting. You focus on finishing the shelter before conditions worsen, aware that storms didn't announce themselves with drama. They crept in quietly, then closed the door behind them. You build the roof low and slanted, overlapping brush so snow will slide instead of sink. Flat roofs collapsed. Tall roofs invited wind. The sweet spot was always lower than comfort wanted. Cowboys slept, crouched, curled, or half-sitting through winter nights. Comfort was seasonal. Survival was constant. As afternoon fades, you test the shelter by sitting inside. The difference is immediate. The wind's roar dulls to a muted hiss. Your breath lingers instead of vanishing. It's not warm, but it's manageable. Cowboys understood that the goal wasn't heat, it was preventing heat loss. That mindset shaped every winter structure, from brush lean-tos to full-sod houses. There's an ongoing scholarly argument about whether cowboys preferred individual shelters or communal ones when possible. Some evidence suggests group shelters conserved heat and morale. Other accounts emphasize the dangers, sickness spreading faster, fires growing riskier, tempers flaring under stress. You feel the weight of that debate now. Alone, you're colder, but in control. Together, you'd be warmer, but vulnerable. As night falls, snow begins to drift gently, almost politely. You know better than to trust it. Gentle snow can bury shelters silently, blocking airflow and entrances. Cowboys learn to wake periodically during storms, checking walls, clearing drifts, ensuring the shelter didn't become a tomb. Sleep in winter was a cautious activity. You lie back, listening to snow whisper against brush. The shelter holds, for now. And in that fragile success, you feel something cowboys rarely spoke of but deeply understood. Gratitude. Not for comfort, but for another night earned. Another small victory against a season that never stopped trying to take everything. You wake to silence so complete it feels wrong. No wind, no snow sliding, no distant animal calls. Winter has a way of going quiet right before it turns dangerous again. Cowboys learned to distrust stillness as much as storms. Silence often meant the air had settled into something heavier, colder, and far less forgiving. You push aside the brush at the shelter's opening and step out carefully. The ground crunches beneath your boots, snow frozen hard as bone. The sky is pale and empty, the sun a weak disk offering more light than warmth. This kind of cold sinks deeper, bypassing clothing and settling straight into muscle and joint. Old cowboys used to say this was the cold that stayed with you long after winter ended, and many carried it into old age as aching reminders. Your shelter stands, but only just. In daylight, you see gaps where wind could slice through if it returns. That's the constant truth of brush windbreaks. They demand maintenance. Cowboys often spent more time repairing shelters than building them in the first place. A few minutes of neglect could undo hours of work. Winter punished complacency faster than any foreman ever could. Today, you decide to improve the walls, not raise them, but thicken them. You lay a brush tighter, stuffing smaller twigs into gaps, packing snow into the outer surface. Snow again becomes ally instead of enemy. Packed correctly, it seals airflow and locks warmth inside. This is one of those counterintuitive survival lessons cowboys learned through repetition rather than explanation. Cold materials, arranged properly, could protect you from even colder air. There's a historical detail that surprises many people. Cowboys sometimes intentionally banked snow against shelters the same way settlers did with sod houses. It wasn't a pioneer-only trick. Range riders borrowed anything that worked. Pride mattered far less than staying alive. Survival blurred the lines between cowboy, homesteader, and anyone else stubborn enough to be here in winter. As you work, your breath forms a steady rhythm, fog rising and dissolving. Movement is heat. Cowboys kept busy in winter not just to maintain camps, but to stay warm. Idleness was dangerous. Even resting had to be planned, timed, and justified. Sit too long and stiffness set in. Stiffness led to slower reactions. Slow reactions in cold could be fatal. You pause to warm your hands and think about wind. Wind was always the enemy behind the enemy. At sub-zero temperatures, moving air-stripped heat at terrifying speed. That's why the simplest shelters, low walls angled just right, often outperformed more elaborate ones. Cowboys learned that stopping wind mattered more than stopping cold. It's a principle modern survival experts still preach, learned the hard way on the open range. There's a strange fringe anecdote from a Montana ranch that claims cowboys once built an emergency shelter entirely from stacked cattle carcasses after a sudden die-off. Historians debate the story's accuracy, but the idea isn't impossible. Frozen bodies, arranged carefully, would block wind and hold shape. Grim, yes, but winter didn't care about dignity. It cared about physics, and cowboys worked with whatever was left standing. By midday, the temperature creeps upward just enough to soften the surface snow. This is dangerous too. Meltwater seeps into clothing and boots, then refreezes as soon as the sun dips again. Moisture was the invisible killer of winter camps. Cowboys obsessed over staying dry, because wet cold drained heat exponentially faster than dry cold. Many shelters failed not because they let wind in, but because they trapped dampness. You adjust the roof, improving runoff, ensuring melting snow won't drip onto where you sleep. Cowboys learned to test shelters during the warmest part of the day, when weaknesses revealed themselves. A drip now was a soaked blanket later, and the soaked blankets meant shivering, exhaustion, and mistakes. As afternoon fades, you gather fuel, another endless winter task. Firewood was never guaranteed. On treeless plains, cowboys burned dried buffalo chips, twisted grass, even old fence posts when nothing else was available. That's a historical fact that still surprises people. Dried dung was a common fuel source, burning hot and clean when fully cured. Winter stripped romance from fire. Flame was function, not comfort. You arrange the fuel carefully outside the shelter, planning a small fire positioned to reflect heat inward, without filling the space with smoke. Fire placement was an art learned through failure. Burn too close and sparks could ignite bedding. Burn too far and heat vanished uselessly into the open air. Cowboys often built low reflector walls behind fires, angled like shields, focusing warmth where it mattered most. There's debate among historians about how often cowboys actually used fires at night during severe cold. Some accounts suggest fires were kept minimal or extinguished entirely to conserve fuel and avoid danger. Others describe men feeding fires hourly through blizzards. The truth likely depended on conditions, experience, and desperation. You feel that uncertainty now, weighing warmth against risk as darkness returns. Night settles again, quieter than before. The shelter feels denser, more secure. You crawl inside, sealing the opening as best you can. The air smells of brush and earth and faint smoke carried on your clothes. It's not pleasant, but it's familiar now. Cowboys often described winter shelters as places that felt alive, not comfortable, but protective, like a crouched animal bracing against the storm. As you lie back, you listen to the subtle sounds of freezing, the soft crack of snow contracting, the whisper of air finding new paths. Your shelter answers with quiet resistance. It holds. And in that holding, you understand another truth the Old West rarely advertised. Survival was built layer by layer, choice by choice, in moments no one ever wrote songs about. You wake with dirt above you instead of sky, and for a split second your body panics before your mind catches up. This is different now. You're underground, or at least halfway there, and the world feels quieter because of it. Cowboys who resorted to dugouts often said the earth itself seemed to breathe slower than the air. Winter sounds soften here, dulled by soil and distance like danger speaking through a closed door. Dugouts weren't elegant, but they were effective. When wood was scarce and wind relentless, the ground became the most reliable building material available. That's a historical fact confirmed by both ranch records and archaeological remains scattered across the plains. Cowboys didn't invent dugouts. Settlers and indigenous peoples had used them long before, but they adopted the idea quickly when winter forced their hand. You crouch low, fingers brushing packed earth walls still cool but steady. Soil holds temperature remarkably well. While the air above ground swings wildly between day and night, the earth resists change. That stability is what makes this place survivable. Cowboys understood this without thermometers or equations. They knew that if you went down instead of up, winter lost some of its leverage. The entrance behind you is small, intentionally so. Dugouts worked best when openings were narrow and angled away from prevailing winds. Some cowboys built short, slanted entry tunnels just long enough to break airflow before it reached the main space. Others simply hung hides or blankets across the opening, sealing it like a wound stitched shut. Every inch of exposed surface was a liability. You sit and notice something else immediately. It's darker. Light doesn't reach well underground, especially when the sun sits low in winter. Dugouts demanded sacrifices, visibility, headroom, comfort. But in exchange, they offered consistency. Cowboys often chose dugouts when they expected to stay put through prolonged cold, storms, or cattle holdovers. Mobility gave way to endurance. There's a quirky detail buried in old ranch accounts that mentions cowboys lining dugout walls with saddle blankets, old coats, or even pages torn from ledgers and newspapers. Insulation was insulation, regardless of dignity. It didn't matter what the walls looked like. It mattered how much heat they stole from you. Winter flattened social rules fast. You run your hand along the wall and feel how dry it is. That's intentional. Moisture was the dugout's greatest enemy. A poorly chosen site could turn into a mud pit after a thaw, sucking heat and morale in equal measure. Cowboys learned to dig into well-drained soil, often on slight slopes where water would move away naturally. Low spots flooded, high spots froze harder. The sweet spot was subtle. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether dugouts were a last resort or a preferred winter solution. Some historians argue cowboys despised them, seeing them as uncomfortable, temporary, and degrading. Others point out how frequently they appear in winter camp descriptions, suggesting they were valued tools in the survival arsenal. Sitting here, you understand both views. It's not pleasant, but it works. Fire inside a dugout was a calculated risk. Some cowboys avoided it entirely, relying on body heat and insulation instead. Others dug shallow fire pits near entrances or used small, carefully vented fires to take the edge off. Carbon monoxide wasn't understood, but its effects were. Men knew that headaches, dizziness, and sudden sleepiness were bad signs. Many fires were kept tiny, symbolic almost, just enough to remind the body what warmth felt like. There's a fringe story from the Dakotas that claims some dugouts used hollowed buffalo skulls as makeshift vents, placed near the roofline to allow smoke to escape. Archaeologists have never conclusively proven this, but skulls have been found in odd structural contexts near dugout sites. Whether functional or symbolic, the image fits the improvisational logic of the range. You lie back and notice how the cold behaves differently here. It doesn't bite, it presses. The earth leans in, cool and heavy, but not hostile. Cowboys often describe dugouts as feeling like being wrapped rather than exposed. That psychological shift mattered. Fear drained energy, stability restored it, shelter protected the mind as much as the body. Outside, wind begins to rise again, but it sounds distant, muffled. That's the true luxury of a dugout. Distance from winter's voice. Brush shelters argued with the wind all night. Dugouts ignored it. Cowboys valued that silence, especially after weeks of exposure. Many men slept deeper underground than they ever had indoors back east, simply because the world finally stopped shouting. By midday you venture out briefly, emerging into sharp light and harsher cold. The contrast is immediate and brutal. Dugouts trained cowboys to move with purpose. You didn't linger outside longer than necessary. Tasks were planned, fuel gathered quickly, cattle checked efficiently, then back into the earth, back into stillness. Another historical fact surfaces here. Dugouts were often reused season after season by different crews. They became unofficial landmarks, passed down through word of mouth rather than maps. There's a hole near the creek bend, someone would say, and everyone knew what that meant. Shelter knowledge travelled quietly across the range, shared because winter demanded cooperation even among strangers. You return inside and block the entrance again, feeling the temperature. Stabilise. This is the part winter doesn't advertise, the waiting. Long hours with little to do but listen, think and endure. Cowboys passed time mending gear, telling stories, or simply sleeping in fragments. Dugouts encouraged this rhythm. They weren't places of action, they were places of patience. As evening arrives, you realise something important. Dugouts didn't just help cowboys survive winter, they changed how they related to the land. Instead of standing against it, they hid within it. Instead of conquering, they adapted. That shift in mindset echoes quietly through frontier history, often overlooked in favour of louder stories. You lie back, eyes adjusting to dimness, feeling the earth hold steady around you. Above, winter does whatever it wants. Down here, you've borrowed a margin of safety, not comfort, not certainty, just enough resistance to keep going. And in the Old West, that was often the difference between becoming a story and living long enough to forget one. You notice the difference immediately when you step inside a sod structure. The air feels heavier, steadier, like it's been sitting still for hours instead of being whipped raw by the plains. Sod houses weren't pretty, and cowboys rarely claimed them with pride, but winter respected them. Grass and earth stacked thick and deliberate, created walls that didn't argue with the cold. They absorbed it, slowed it, and quietly pushed back. Sod houses existed because the land demanded them. On the treeless plains, timber was scarce, expensive, or completely absent. Cowboys working winter line camps often partnered with homesteaders or reused abandoned claims, reinforcing sod structures for seasonal survival. That's a historical fact supported by land office records and ranch correspondence. When winter closed in, sod beat canvas and brush every time. You run your hand along the wall and feel the texture, roots, soil, compacted life from seasons past. Grass held these walls together, its tangled root systems acting like natural rebar. When cut correctly, sod bricks could weigh upwards of 80 pounds each. Cowboys learned quickly that building with sod wasn't fast work, but it paid dividends once the temperature dropped. The roof matters most. Sod houses often used a base layer of poles or rough planks if available, topped with brush, then capped with thick sod. Heavy, yes, but weight was an asset. Wind couldn't lift what gravity held firmly in place. Snow piled on top, adding insulation instead of danger. Unlike lighter shelters, sod welcomed winter's weight. You sit down and realise something else. It's quiet in a different way than the dugout. Not muffled, but insulated. Sound doesn't disappear here, it softens. Cowboys appreciated that subtlety. Sod houses didn't cut you off from the world entirely. You could still hear cattle shift outside or boots crunch nearby. That connection mattered, especially during long holds when isolation gnawed at the edges of sanity. There's a quirky fact that surprises many people. Sod houses were often warmer than early wooden cabins. Wood let wind sneak through gaps as it dried and warped. Sod stayed dense and sealed. Cowboys who wintered in both often remarked that sod felt damp but kind, while wood felt sharp and mean in extreme cold. Comfort, it turns out, was relative. Moisture, however, was the trade-off. Sod walls could sweat during temperature swings, especially when fires burned inside. Cowboys fought this with ventilation gaps near the roofline or by burning small, controlled fires. Too much heat turned walls muddy. Too little invited frost. Managing a sod shelter required attention, not unlike tending livestock. Neglect showed quickly. You adjust a flap near the roof and feel the air shift. That's another historical detail. Many sod shelters had primitive vents long before chimneys became standard. Cowboys learned to respect smoke and stale air, even if they didn't fully understand why. Headaches, dizziness, and restless sleep were warnings passed down quietly between men, taken seriously because winter punished mistakes. There's an odd frontier belief tied to sod houses that crops up in a few oral histories. Some cowboys claimed sod structures felt alive during storms, creaking and settling as temperatures changed. Scientifically, that's thermal contraction and expansion. Culturally, it fed the sense that you were sharing space with the land itself. Living walls blurred boundaries in ways timber never did. As you settle in, you notice how the temperature changes slowly instead of sharply. Daytime warmth lingers. Nighttime cold arrives late and less aggressively. This thermal lag made sod ideal for brutal extended winters. Cowboys holding cattle through months of snow valued predictability above all else. You could plan around steady cold. You couldn't plan around sudden exposure. There's ongoing debate among historians about whether cowboys genuinely preferred sod shelters or merely tolerated them. Some diaries describe sod houses as depressing, dark and claustrophobic. Others praise their warmth and reliability. The disagreement likely reflects personality as much as practicality. Some men needed sky and space. Others needed to stop shaking long enough to sleep. You notice the floor, packed earth, sometimes layered with straw or hides. Not luxurious, but functional. Cowboys understood that cold rose from the ground as much as it fell from the sky. Insulating beneath you mattered. Many winter deaths came not from freezing air but from heat drained silently through contact. Sod floors, when managed well, reduced that loss. Outside, the wind rises again, but you barely hear it. Sod walls break its rhythm, scatter its force. That's the magic of mass. Where brush deflects, sod absorbs. Cowboys working open range learned to appreciate mass quickly. Light shelters were mobile, heavy shelters were dependable. Winter favoured dependability. There's a fringe anecdote from Nebraska that claims some sod shelters included buried bottles or jars in the walls, believed to break cold air as it passed through. There's no evidence this did anything physically, but bottles have been found embedded in sod ruins. Whether superstition, recycling, or boredom fueled experimentation, it reflects how deeply winter encouraged creative thinking. You lie back and let the quiet work on you. Sod shelters encouraged longer stays, deeper rest. Cowboys wintering in them often stayed put for weeks, venturing out only when necessary. This had psychological effects historians still discuss. Some argue sod life dulled restlessness and promoted patience. Others suggest it amplified loneliness. Either way, winter reshaped behaviour. By evening, you tend the fire carefully, keeping it low. The walls glow faintly in the flicker, earth tones shifting like slow breath. You realise something important here. Sod houses weren't just shelters, they were commitments. Building one meant you planned to endure, not escape. Cowboys who chose sod accepted winter on its terms. As night deepens, the temperature drops, but inside it holds steady. You're not warm, but you're not fighting. That distinction mattered more than comfort ever could. Cowboys learned that winning against winter was impossible. Surviving it required cooperation with land, materials and limits. You close your eyes, listening to the fire crack softly, feeling the earth settle around you. Above, Grass sleeps under snow. Around you, roots and soil keep their quiet promise. Sod doesn't brag, it just holds. And for a cowboy staring down another endless winter night, holding was everything. You smell the cabin before you fully see it. Green wood, sap, smoke baked into grain. Logline cabins announce themselves quietly, solid and unmovable against the white. After days of earth and grass, standing walls of timber feel almost extravagant. Cowboys didn't build these often, but when they did, it meant winter wasn't passing through quickly. It meant staying. Log cabins on the range were usually the product of cooperation. A single cowboy rarely had the time or energy to fell, trim, haul, and stack logs alone. These shelters appeared near line camps, river bottoms, or timber edges where crews wintered cattle. That's a historical fact reflected in ranch payrolls and supply logs. Extra hands were assigned when cabins went up, because winter justified the effort. You step inside and feel the immediate difference. The air smells drier. The cold behaves differently here. Sharper at first, but easier to push back once heat takes hold. Wood doesn't absorb cold the way earth does. It reflects warmth quickly, which made cabins responsive but temperamental. Cowboys learned that log shelters demanded attention. Ignore them, and they turned against you. The logs themselves matter. Green logs sealed better, but shrank as they dried, opening gaps. Dry logs stacked faster but leaked wind unless chinked carefully. Cowboys filled gaps with mud, moss, grass, even old rags. Chinking was constant work. Freeze-thaw cycles cracked it open again and again. A cabin was never finished. It was maintained. You run your hand along a wall and feel the roughness, splinters catching skin. These weren't planned boards. They were trees made cooperative through force and necessity. Corners were notched simply. Saddle notches, V-notches, whatever the builder knew. Precision mattered less than mass and fit. Winter forgave ugly work, not loose work. There's a quirky historical detail often overlooked. Some cowboy cabins were intentionally built small, even cramped, to conserve heat. A smaller air volume warmed faster and stayed warmer longer. Pride suggested bigger was better. Experience said otherwise. Many cabins barely allowed you to stand fully upright. Comfort bowed to physics. Fire was the heart of a log cabin, and also its greatest danger. Cowboys placed fireplaces carefully, often on stone or packed earth hearths. Chimneys were crude, sometimes nothing more than stacked rock and mud. Sparks were constant threats. Entire line camps burned in minutes when chimneys failed during high winds. That risk shaped behaviour. Fires were watched like livestock, fed slowly, never trusted. There's debate among historians about how common indoor fires were at night. Some accounts describe fires banked low, coals glowing until morning. Others claim fires were allowed to die entirely to avoid accidents. You feel that tension now, sitting near warmth that comforts and threatens at the same time. Winter forced constant calculation. A fringe story circulates in Wyoming folklore about cowboys hanging rawhide strips above cabin doors, believing they shrank in cold and sealed drafts tighter. While rawhide does contract when dry, evidence of this practice is scarce. Still, rawhide has been found nailed in odd places in cabin ruins. Whether practical or hopeful, it shows how seriously cowboys treated airflow. Wind was the real killer, and anything that slowed it was worth trying. As night settles, you notice how the cabin responds. Logs creak as temperatures drop, joints tightening with sharp, sudden pops. Cowboys often described cabins as talkative in winter. The sounds weren't comforting, but they were familiar. Silence inside a log cabin usually meant something was wrong. No fire, no life. Moisture was less of an issue here than in sod, but not absent. Snow tracked in melted near the fire, refroze by the door. Wet boots were a hazard. Cowboys elevated bedding whenever possible, using bunks made from poles or planks. Sleeping directly on the floor meant cold climbed into you all night. Elevation mattered. There's a historical fact tied to this that surprises many people. Some winter cabins had dirt floors intentionally left exposed rather than boarded. Dirt absorbed, moisture better, and didn't rot. Wood floors were a luxury and often impractical. Again, function beat comfort. Winter made decisions simple. You settle near the fire and feel warmth spread quickly, almost aggressively. This is the advantage of wood. Heat reflects and circulates faster. Cowboys valued that immediacy after long days outside. Coming in frozen and thawing rapidly restored morale. But rapid thaw came with risks too. Chilblains, cracked skin, swelling. Men learned to warm gradually, even when temptation argued otherwise. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether log cabins marked a cultural shift for cowboys, from transient labourers to semi-settled workers. Some argue cabins encouraged permanence, altering cowboy identity. Others say they were seasonal tools abandoned when grass returned. Sitting here, you sense both truths. Cabins anchored winter, but they didn't claim loyalty. When spring came, doors closed and riders moved on. You notice personal touches, names carved into logs, tally marks scratched near bunks, a bent nail serving as a hat hook. These details appear in surviving cabins and ruins. Cowboys rarely wrote letters in winter, but they left marks, proof they were here, proof they endured. Outside, wind rattles the walls, but it doesn't penetrate easily. Logs resist better than brush, better than canvas. Weight matters again. Mass buys time. Cowboys knew that if a shelter could slow winter long enough, dawn eventually did the rest. As the fire settles into steady rhythm, you feel your body relax in a way it hasn't since winter began. Not safe, not entirely, but buffered. Log cabins offered that buffer, temporary control in an uncontrollable season. They didn't defeat winter, they negotiated with it. When you finally lie down, the cabin holds heat close, air heavy with smoke and resin. You listen to the logs adjusting, fire whispering, wind failing to find purchase. Tomorrow will bring maintenance, more chinking, more fuel gathering. Cabins demanded loyalty and labour, but tonight, wrapped in wood and flame, you understand why cowboys remembered these shelters long after others faded. Sod held, earth embraced, but wood fought back, and in a winter that respected resistance, that made all the difference. You don't build this shelter so much as discover it. A rock overhang, a shallow cave, a cliff face that leans just enough to keep snow off your back. Cowboys learned to see these places not as scenery, but as invitations. Nature occasionally offered a head start. In winter, you took it without question. Rock shelters were prized because they demanded less effort and returned more certainty. Stone didn't burn, rot, or shrink. It didn't mind wind or weight. Once you found a good overhang, half the work was already done. That's a historical fact backed by journals and archaeological finds. Many winter camps reused the same rock shelters year after year, sometimes for decades. You step beneath the stone and feel the temperature change immediately. Not warmer exactly, but steadier. Rock absorbs heat slowly and releases it just as slowly. Like sod and earth, it resists sudden change. Cowboys recognized this behavior even if they didn't name it. They knew stone made winter less unpredictable, and unpredictability was what killed men. The placement matters. South-facing rock shelters were gold. They caught winter sun, stored it through the day, and gave it back at night. North-facing ones stayed brutally cold, damp, and hostile. Cowboys learned this distinction fast. A poorly oriented rock shelter could be worse than none at all. Shelter that trapped cold was a betrayal. You notice smoke stains darkening the stone above a natural recess. Generations of small fires have left their mark here. Cowboys favoured fires placed just inside the drip line of an overhang, where smoke could escape without filling the sleeping space. Fire placement again becomes art. Stone reflects heat well, but too much flame cracks it. Cracked stone sheds flakes, sometimes violently. Winter shelters demanded restraint. There's a quirky fact buried in frontier accounts that some cowboys believed certain rock shelters breathed better than others, allowing smoke and stale air to escape naturally. Scientifically, this was about airflow and fissures. Culturally, it created reputations. Men passed along advice about good rocks and bad ones the way sailors talked about safe harbours. You arrange bedding along the back wall where drafts are weakest. Cowboys often stacked saddles, bedrolls and gear to form secondary windbreaks inside rock shelters. Layers mattered. One wall blocked the big wind. Smaller walls blocked what slipped through. Shelter in winter was redundancy. Moisture becomes the next concern. Rock sweats when temperatures fluctuate. Condensation beads on stone and drips unpredictably. Cowboys managed this by choosing higher ground within shelters, sleeping on raised platforms when possible, or lining walls with hides. A dry rock shelter was survivable, a wet one drained heat relentlessly. There's an ongoing debate among historians about how long cowboys actually stayed in rock shelters. Some evidence suggests they were used mainly for short-term refuge during storms. Other finds, hearths, tool fragments, layered ash, indicate extended occupation. The truth likely depended on conditions. Rock shelters were opportunistic. They worked as long as they worked. Outside, wind howls along the cliff face, but inside it fractures, loses strength, breaks apart. You hear it in pieces rather than waves. That fragmentation is what keeps you alive. Cowboys learned to judge shelter quality by sound as much as feel. A good shelter changed the voice of winter. There's a fringe tale from Utah that claims cowboys once survived a week-long blizzard by sealing the open side of a rock shelter with stacked hay bales and wagon tarps, creating a temporary cave. It sounds extreme, but not impossible. Hay insulates remarkably well when dry. In winter, extreme solutions often made sense. You test the stone floor and decide to add insulation beneath you. Bare rock pulls heat fast. Cowboys often spread grass, brush, or spare clothing under bedding. Elevation mattered again. Contact with cold materials was always a threat. The goal wasn't to eliminate cold, but to slow how quickly it stole from you. As night falls, the rock radiates the day's stored warmth faintly but perceptibly. It's subtle, but you feel it in your back, a gentle resistance against the dropping temperature. Cowboys appreciated subtle gains. Winter survival wasn't built on big wins. It was built on small edges stacked carefully. There's a historical fact tied to these shelters that rarely makes popular histories. Rock shelters were often shared spaces between cowboys and indigenous travellers, sometimes sequentially, sometimes simultaneously. Evidence of mixed use appears in tool marks, fire pits, and artifacts. Winter blurred territorial lines. Survival encouraged cooperation, or at least quiet tolerance. You lie back and look at the stone ceiling, darkened by soot and time. It feels ancient, indifferent to your presence. That indifference is comforting. Rock doesn't care who you are. It doesn't judge effort. It simply exists. In a winter that judged everything, that neutrality mattered. Outside, snow begins to fall again, ticking softly against stone. Inside, the sound fades quickly. The shelter does its job without asking for maintenance, without demanding materials you don't have. Cowboys valued that simplicity. Less work meant more energy saved for staying alive. As you drift towards sleep, you realize something important. Rock shelters didn't represent human ingenuity so much as humility. You didn't conquer the land here, you accepted its offer. You took shelter where the land already knew how to shelter itself. In the Old West, that kind of wisdom rarely made headlines. But it kept men breathing through nights they had no business surviving, and sometimes that was enough. You don't expect much warmth from fabric, and winter quickly teaches you not to. Canvas shelters, tarps, and wagon beds were never about comfort. They were about speed. When storms arrived too fast for digging or building, cowboys reached for what they already had. Fabric was portable shelter, imperfect but immediate, and sometimes immediacy mattered more than durability. You shake snow from a canvas tarp and feel how stiff it's become. Frozen fabric doesn't drape, it resists. Cowboys learned this the hard way, wrestling tarps that behaved more like thin boards than cloth. That's a historical fact recorded in winter camp letters. Canvas became brittle in extreme cold, cracking if folded carelessly. Handling it demanded patience. The simplest canvas shelter was a lean-to, one edge staked low to the ground, the other lifted just enough to crawl beneath. Cowboys angled them sharply into the wind, sacrificing headroom for protection. Tall canvas shelters failed fast. Wind found its way inside, ballooned the fabric, and ripped stakes free. Low and tight survived. You anchor the tarp with rocks, gear, anything heavy. Weight mattered more than knots. Cowboys often slept with one boot or saddle pressed against the canvas edge, acting as human ballast. It wasn't elegant, but it kept the shelter from flapping itself to death in the night. Winter punished loose ends relentlessly. Wagon beds offered a different kind of fabric shelter. Turned on their sides or ends, wagons became instant windbreaks. Canvas covers stretched over bows formed curved roofs that shed snow surprisingly well. Many cowboys preferred wagon shelters during drives or winter holds because they combined storage, shelter, and mobility. That's a historical fact supported by trail inventories and photographs. You crawl beneath a wagon bed and notice the smell. Dust, grease, old grain. It's not pleasant, but it's familiar. Familiarity mattered in winter. A known space calmed nerves. Cowboys often described sleeping better beneath wagons than in open shelters. Not because it was warmer, but because it felt defined. Walls, even fabric ones, gave shape to the night. There's a quirky detail from period accounts that mentions cowboys lining canvas shelters with newspapers when available. Paper trapped air, blocked drafts, and burned easily when no longer needed. It's a fringe fact that sounds improvised because it was. Winter rewarded improvisation far more than planning. Canvas alone did little against cold, so layering became essential. Cowboys piled blankets, hides, coats, and spare clothing against tarp walls. Some built inner nests, small sleeping pockets inside larger shelters. This reduced the air volume that needed warming. It's the same principle behind small cabins and dugouts applied to fabric. Fire near canvas was dangerous but tempting. Cowboys learned to build fires offset from shelters, using reflectors, wagon wheels, rocks, even stacked gear, to bounce heat inward. Sparks were constant threats. Many winter camps bore scorch marks, where a moment's inattention nearly ended everything. Fire demanded respect, especially near fabric. There's an ongoing debate among historians about whether canvas shelters were truly viable in severe winters or merely stopgap measures. Some accounts describe men surviving weeks beneath tarps. Others suggest canvas failed quickly once storms intensified. The truth likely depended on wind, snow, and experience. Canvas didn't forgive mistakes. It amplified them. You notice moisture immediately. Breath condenses on fabric, freezes, then thaws when the fire burns. Water drips unpredictably. Cowboys hated damp canvas more than cold canvas. Wet fabric sucked heat fast and stiffened further when refrozen. Managing ventilation without inviting wind became a constant balancing act. There's a fringe story from Texas panhandle camps that claims cowboys rubbed grease or tallow into canvas to improve water resistance and block wind. While no direct evidence proves widespread use, treated canvas was known in other frontier contexts. The idea fits winter logic. Anything that sealed fabric, even temporarily, was worth trying. As night falls, wind tests the shelter immediately. Canvas answers with sound, snapping, popping, flapping like restless wings. Cowboys learned to judge shelter health by that noise. A steady, low rustle was acceptable. Sharp cracks meant stress. Stress meant failure. Many men slept lightly under canvas, waking repeatedly to adjust stakes and weights. You pull your bedding tight and focus on conserving heat. Cowboys often slept fully clothed in canvas shelters, boots loosened but never removed. If the shelter failed suddenly, you needed to move fast. Winter punished hesitation. Being dressed was insurance. There's a historical fact tied to wagon shelters that often gets overlooked. Wagons were sometimes intentionally positioned to catch snowdrifts on one side, using accumulated snow as insulation. Snow banked against wagon walls blocked wind and added mass. It's another example of using winter against itself. Cold materials, arranged wisely, could save you. Psychologically, canvas shelters were taxing. The constant noise, movement, and awareness of fragility wore on men. Cowboys wrote about feeling exposed even while technically sheltered. Unlike sod or rock, canvas never let you forget what it was up against. Some men preferred that honesty, others found it exhausting. You lie awake listening to the fabric flex and settle, feeling every gust translated through thin material. This is shelter at its bare minimum. No illusions, just resistance. Cowboys who endured winters under canvas earned a particular respect among their peers. Not because it was heroic, but because it demanded vigilance. By morning, frost lines the inside of the tarp, glittering faintly in early light. You survived another night, but you know this isn't sustainable long term. Canvas shelters bought time. They didn't buy seasons. Cowboys used them while searching for better ground, better materials, or simply waiting for weather to break. As you crawl out, stiff and tired, you understand where canvas fits in the hierarchy of winter survival. It's not strong, it's not warm, but it's fast. And sometimes, fast is the only option winter leaves you. In the Old West, speed often decided who lived long enough to build something better. Canvas gave cowboys that chance, thin, flapping, unreliable, but available. And in a season that killed without hesitation, availability was a kind of mercy. You feel the difference the moment hides and wool enter the equation. The air doesn't change, but your body does. Insulation isn't about warming space, it's about trapping yourself inside a pocket winter can't easily steal from. Cowboys learned this through trial, error, and long, shaking nights. When shelters ran out of strength, animal warmth filled the gap. Buffalo hides were the gold standard. Thick, heavy, and stubborn, they blocked wind better than almost anything else available on the plains. That's a historical fact backed by supply records and first-hand accounts. Cowboys used hides as doors, roofs, floor coverings, and interior walls. A brush shelter wrapped in hides became something else entirely, less fragile, more deliberate. You lift a hide and feel its weight pull against your arms. This isn't fabric. This is mass. Cowboys valued mass in winter. It resisted movement, held shape, and didn't care about wind tantrums. Hides stayed where you put them, especially when frozen. Once positioned, they became part of the structure itself. Wool worked differently, but just as importantly. Blankets, coats, saddle pads, anything wool stayed warm even when damp. That property made it invaluable. Cowboys preferred wool over cotton in winter because cotton held moisture and robbed heat. Many men learned this distinction painfully. Wet cotton killed quietly. Wool forgave mistakes. You layer wool along shelter walls, stuffing it into gaps where wind sneaks through. Cowboys used what they had, not what manuals recommended. Saddles became windbreaks, coats became insulation, bedrolls became doors, winter flattened categories. Everything was either useful or expendable, and usefulness changed hourly. There's a quirky historical detail that some cowboys believed buffalo hair-oriented outward blocked wind better than hair inward. Scientifically, orientation likely mattered little once the hide was cured, but belief shaped behaviour. Cowboys positioned hides with care, convinced details mattered. In winter, attention to detail often separated survivors from stories. Fire and hides were uneasy partners, sparks burned holes instantly, and burning hair smelled terrible and dangerous. Cowboys learned to hang hides at angles that deflected sparks or kept them just far enough from flame. Fire placement again became negotiation. Warmth without destruction, protection without complacency. There's debate among historians about how common buffalo hides were after the great herds declined. Some argue hides became rare and valuable, limiting their use in shelters. Others point to continued availability through trade and stockpiles well into the late 19th century. The truth varies by region. Where hides existed, they were used until they fell apart. You notice how hides change sound. Wind that hissed through brush now dulls to a low murmur. That acoustic shift mattered. Cowboys judged shelter quality by how much winter could still speak. Hides quieted it. Quiet meant less energy spent staying alert. There's a fringe anecdote from Colorado camps that claims cowboys stuffed grass or straw between double layers of hides, creating crude insulated panels. Archaeological evidence of layered bedding supports the possibility. It's not elegant, but it's effective. Trapped air does the real work. Materials just hold it still. As night falls, you wrap yourself in wool and feel heat stabilize. Not increase, stabilize. That's the goal. Cowboys understood that generating heat took calories they didn't always have. Holding heat was cheaper. Shelters and insulation worked together. One without the other failed. Moisture management becomes easier now. Wool absorbs water without feeling wet and continues insulating. Hides shed snow and block dripping condensation. Cowboys preferred hides as ground layers because they kept bedding dry, even when floors were frozen or damp. Dry ground meant less heat loss through contact. There's a historical fact tied to winter cattle camps that often surprises people. Some outfits issued extra blankets specifically for use as shelter materials, not bedding. They were meant to plug gaps, line walls, and seal doors. Sleeping was secondary. Staying alive came first. Psychologically, hides and wool provided comfort beyond physics. They smelled familiar. Animals, smoke, grease. Familiar smells anchored men mentally during long isolation. Cowboys often wrote about missing home in winter, and familiar textures helped. Shelter wasn't just structure, it was reassurance. You sit back and feel the shelter finally push back against the cold in a meaningful way. Brush, sod, wood, they set the frame. Hides and wool finished the job. Cowboys knew this combination well. Structure blocked wind, insulation blocked loss. Together, they made winter tolerable. There's an ongoing scholarly discussion about whether insulation mattered more than shelter type in cowboy survival. Some argue the best shelter failed without proper insulation. Others claim good placement and design outweighed materials. Sitting here, wrapped and protected, you suspect both sides are right. Winter demanded balance. As the night deepens, you listen to the muted world outside. Wind complains, snow slides, but nothing intrudes. The shelter feels layered, intentional. This is no longer a temporary defense, it's a system. Cowboys built systems out of scraps because winter forced them to think that way. You close your eyes, warmth held close by wool and hide, and realize something quietly important. Cowboys didn't survive winter by building one perfect shelter. They survived by stacking imperfect solutions until winter ran out of leverage. In the Old West, that stacking, layer upon layer of small practical choices, was the real craft. And in moments like this, when the cold finally stops gaining ground, you feel the truth of it settle in. You learn quickly that fire is not warmth by default. Fire is potential, dangerous, fickle, and only useful if handled with restraint. Cowboys didn't fear fire, but they respected it deeply, especially in winter shelters where air was limited and mistakes multiplied. Fast. Heat could save you, but it could also quietly end you in your sleep. You crouch near a small flame and feel its pull. The instinct is to feed it, to make it bigger, brighter, louder. Cowboys learned to fight that instinct. Large fires burned oxygen quickly and filled shelters with smoke that clung low and heavy. Carbon monoxide wasn't named yet, but its effects were known. Men talked about bad air, about waking dizzy or not waking at all. Fire placement became survival science long before science named it. Most winter shelters kept fires outside whenever possible. A fire built just beyond the entrance, paired with a reflective wall of rock, earth, or gear, sent heat inward without stealing breathable air. That's a historical fact repeated across regions. Cowboys learned that reflected heat felt weaker, but lasted longer, and didn't suffocate you. Slow warmth beats sudden danger. You angle a reflector wall carefully, testing how heat moves. Even a few inches changes everything. Cowboys experimented constantly, moving rocks, shifting angles, adjusting distance. Fire wasn't static. It was a living thing that demanded attention. Leave it unattended, and winter or flame would take advantage. Inside shelters where fires were unavoidable, placement became even more precise. Near entrances, low to the ground, with ventilation gaps always preserved. Cowboys often slept with their heads away from fires, feet closer, letting heat rise and move across bodies without pooling dangerously. Positioning mattered. Inches mattered. There's a quirky detail buried in winter camp accounts that mentions cowboys hanging tin cups or pans near fires to listen for changes in sound. A sudden silence or change in pitch meant airflow had shifted, smoke backing up. It's not scientific instrumentation, but it worked. Sound became warning. Winter sharpened senses that comfort dulled. Fuel choice mattered too. Greenwood smoked heavily and burned poorly. Dry wood burned hot and fast. Dung burned steadily, but smelled and required careful placement. Cowboys mixed fuels deliberately, using slow-burning materials to maintain coals rather than flames. Coals were safer, flames were greedy. There's an ongoing debate among historians about how often cowboys allowed fires to burn overnight. Some accounts describe men waking hourly to tend small coals. Others insist fires were extinguished entirely before sleep. The truth depended on shelter type, fuel availability, and experience. You feel that calculation now. How much risk buys how much rest? A fringe anecdote from New Mexico camps claims some cowboys used heated rocks, buried beneath ash, as radiant heat sources overnight. Stones heated during the day released warmth slowly without flame. While not widespread, similar techniques appear in indigenous practices, suggesting knowledge crossed quietly between cultures. Winter encouraged borrowing without credit. You notice how fire changes air movement. Warm air rises, pulling cold air inward. If ventilation is wrong, fire becomes a pump that drags winter straight inside. Cowboys learn to manage this by leaving low vents open while sealing higher gaps. Counterintuitive, but effective. Cold air entered low, warmed, and rose out slowly instead of rushing in. There's a historical fact tied to winter deaths that still chills modern readers. Several men died not from freezing, but from overheating and dehydration inside poorly ventilated shelters. Fire dried air brutally. Cowboys learned to drink water even when cold suppressed thirst. Shelter safety included hydration, something rarely mentioned in romantic histories. You adjust the fire again, reducing it to glowing coals. The shelter feels calmer, quieter. Fire no longer dominates the space, it supports it. Cowboys preferred this stage, the moment when heat steadied and danger receded slightly. Too much flame kept nerves on edge. Psychologically, fire mattered as much as physically. It anchored time. Cowboys judged hours by how often fuel needed adding. In long winter nights, that rhythm kept men oriented. Lose track of time in winter, and mistakes followed. Fire was a clock as much as a heater. You listen to the crackle soften, feel warmth stabilize. This is fire used correctly, not as spectacle, but as tool. Cowboys who survived winter longest were rarely the boldest. They were the ones who managed risk quietly, consistently, without drama. As the night deepens, you bank the coals and settle back. The shelter holds its balance, warm enough, breathable, stable. Fire glows without demanding attention. That balance was hard-won knowledge passed between men who rarely wrote it down. In the Old West, fire wasn't a symbol of comfort. It was a test of judgment. Use it well, and winter loosened its grip. Use it poorly, and shelter became a trap. You close your eyes, warmth present but contained, air still sweet enough to breathe. The fire has done its job without reminding you it could do more. And in winter, that restraint, quiet, controlled, almost invisible, was the true mark of survival wisdom. You discover that snow, the thing you feared most, can also be one of your best building materials. Used correctly, it becomes insulation, ballast, and shield all at once. Cowboys didn't arrive at this insight easily. It came from watching what survived storms and what didn't. Time and again, shelters banked with snow outlasted those left bare. You step outside and start pushing snow against the shelter walls, packing it down with boots and gloved hands. The work feels backward, adding cold to fight cold, but it works. Snow traps air, and trapped air resists heat loss. That's a historical fact recognised by cowboys long before modern insulation explained why. Winter rewarded those willing to rethink instinct. You're careful not to block ventilation. Snow was helpful until it wasn't. Seal a shelter too tightly, and stale air built up fast. Cowboys learned to leave small channels near rooflines or entrances, checking them regularly during storms. Many men survived the cold only to suffocate quietly because snow drifted overnight. Vigilance mattered. Banking snow also anchored shelters physically. Wind couldn't lift what was pinned down. Canvas stopped flapping. Brush walls stopped rattling. Even log cabins benefited. Snow packed against lower logs sealed gaps where chinking had cracked. Cowboys saw snow as winter's mortar, filling what time and weather broke open. There's a quirky detail from winter camp descriptions that mentions cowboys using sled runners, fence rails, or even wagon tongues to shape snowbanks into clean angles. Smooth surfaces shed wind better than jagged piles. Cowboys shaped snow like they shaped earth, deliberately. Structure mattered even when the material felt temporary. You notice the sound change as the banks grow. Wind dulls. The shelter feels heavier, quieter, more serious. Cowboys judge success by that silence. A well-banked shelter made winter sound tired, as if it had to work harder to be heard. That acoustic feedback guided adjustments. There's debate among historians about how widely snowbanking was practiced among cowboys versus settlers. Some argue it was borrowed from homesteading traditions. Others suggest cowboys adopted it independently through trial and error. Either way, it spread quickly because it worked. Winter didn't care where ideas came from. You stopped periodically to clear snow from critical areas. Roof lines, vents, entrances. Snow helped, till it collapsed structures or sealed openings. Cowboys learned to patrol shelters during storms, waking every few hours to knock drifts back. Sleep became segmented. Survival dictated schedules. A fringe anecdote from the northern plains claims some cowboys intentionally allowed snow to drift over low shelters entirely, leaving only a small air hole like an igloo vent. While extreme snow-covered shelters have been documented archaeologically. Complete coverage offered excellent insulation, but demanded constant attention. One blocked vent ended everything. Inside, the difference becomes clear quickly. Temperature steadies, drafts soften, the shelter feels anchored to the land rather than perched on it. Cowboys often described banked shelters as feeling settled, a word that appears repeatedly in journals. Snow made temporary shelters feel permanent, at least for the night. There's a historical fact tied to winter cattle camps that often surprises people. Snow was sometimes deliberately piled to create windbreak corridors between shelters and work areas. Cowboys built snow walls to protect paths to corrals, water sources and fires. Winter infrastructure extended beyond sleeping spaces. Movement mattered too. You sit and feel how the floor stays warmer now. Less cold air sweeps through. Contact cold diminishes. Cowboys understood that eliminating drafts was often more important than adding heat. Heat without control escaped instantly. Control without heat still bought time. There's an ongoing scholarly discussion about whether snow insulation could fully replace other materials in extreme conditions. Some argue snow alone wasn't enough. Others point to survival accounts where snow did most of the work. The likely truth is layered again. Snow worked best when combined with structure and insulation. Winter demanded systems, not single solutions. Outside, snowfall intensifies, but you feel less urgency. The shelter holds differently now. Snow is no longer enemy pressure, it's reinforcement. Cowboys learned to read storms this way. The first snow threatened, later snow protected. Understanding that shift reduced panic and improved decisions. You listen to the muffled world and feel the shelter absorb winter's energy. There's a psychological comfort in knowing the storm is working for you instead of against you. Cowboys rarely described peace in winter, but this came close. As night deepens, you mark the location of vents mentally, promising to check them later. Snow required maintenance. Nothing in winter was passive. Even helpful materials demanded respect. Cowboys survived by staying engaged even while resting. You lie back, warmth held more evenly now, shelter pressed into the land by white weight. Snow creaks and settles, but nothing collapses. The structure breathes slowly, deliberately. This is winter cooperation, not combat. In the Old West, learning to use snow marked a turning point. It meant you'd stopped reacting and started adapting. Cowboys who reached that point didn't conquer winter. They learned how to let it hold them together instead of pulling them apart. You learn quickly that shelter changes when it holds more than one body. Warmth multiplies, but so do risks. Cowboys face this choice every winter. Sleep alone and control your space, or group together and share heat, labour and uncertainty. There was no perfect answer, only trade-offs. You step into a shared shelter and feel the difference immediately. The air is warmer, thicker with breath and smoke residue. Body heat accumulates fast in enclosed spaces. That's a historical fact noted repeatedly in winter camp accounts. Cowboys understood that one man shivered, but 3 men changed the room. Heat, once shared, became a collective resource. Group shelters formed naturally during cattle holds, blizzards, or extended winter stays. Brush shelters were enlarged, dugouts widened, cabins filled beyond comfort. Cowboys who might ride alone all summer crowded together when cold demanded it. Winter reshaped social boundaries as surely as it reshaped land. But shared warmth came with shared problems. Air quality degraded faster. Moisture increased. Illness spread easily. Cowboys worried about camp coughs and fevers that lingered all season. There's a historical fact here that often surprises people. Winter sickness, not injury, sidelined many cowboys for months. Shelters that saved lives could also slowly weaken them. You notice how men arrange themselves instinctively. Feet toward the centre, heads near walls or vents. Experienced cowboys position themselves to minimise risk, not maximise comfort. Newer hands gravitated toward fire and paid for it later with headaches or burns. Knowledge in winter was visible in posture. There's a quirky detail from some cattle camps where men slept in alternating directions, head to foot, foot to head, to distribute warmth and reduce direct exposure to breath. Whether it significantly helped is debatable, but the practice appears in multiple accounts. Winter encouraged experimentation, even with sleep. You listen to the sounds of a group shelter at night. Snoring, shifting, coughing, the occasional curse. Noise was constant. Cowboys unused to close quarters struggled at first. Privacy vanished. Personal space dissolved. Winter forced intimacy among men who otherwise valued distance. There's an ongoing debate among historians about whether communal shelters improved survival rates overall. Some argue shared heat reduced hypothermia dramatically. Others point to outbreaks of illness and accidents as evidence that grouping increased long-term risk. Both views find support. Survival wasn't just about tonight. It was about making it through the season. You notice how group shelters demanded rules, even unspoken ones. Who tends the fire? Who wakes to check vents? Who clears snow from entrances? Cowboys rotated duties, sometimes amicably, sometimes bitterly. Winter magnified small conflicts. A missed watch could kill everyone. Accountability mattered. A fringe anecdote from a Wyoming line camp claims cowboys once tied a rope across a shared shelter at chest height so men wouldn't roll too close to the fire while sleeping. There's no direct proof, but similar safety measures appear in mining camps. The idea fits winter logic. Prevent accidents before they happen. You feel the psychological shift of not being alone. Fear dulls slightly when others breathe nearby. Cowboys rarely admitted fear, but winter stripped pretense. Companionship became a survival tool. Men told stories, argued, sang quietly. Mental warmth mattered almost as much as physical. Yet solitude had its own advantages. Solo shelters stayed drier, quieter, easier to manage. One man controlled ventilation perfectly for himself. Cowboys who preferred solitude often accepted colder nights in exchange for better sleep and less risk. Winter didn't reward one temperament over another. It demanded self-knowledge. You think about the historical fact that some cowboys deliberately chose solitary shelter even during blizzards, believing shared shelters were more dangerous. These men were often older, more experienced, or simply stubborn. Many survived, some didn't. Winter never confirmed philosophies, it only delivered outcomes. As the night wears on, you notice how group heat fluctuates. When men fall asleep, warmth rises. When someone steps outside, it dips. Shared shelter becomes a living system, constantly adjusting. Cowboys learn to read these shifts the way sailors read seas. There's an emotional fatigue that comes with communal winter living. No escape, no silence. Cowboys wrote about longing for spring not just for grass and movement, but for space. Winter compressed lives inward. Shelter made survival possible, but it also made endurance heavy. You lie back and listen to breathing around you, steady and uneven, familiar and strange. The shelter holds. Warmth lingers. Risks remain. This is winter compromise in its clearest form. In the Old West, survival often meant choosing who you'd survive with. Group shelters turned winter into a shared burden, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. Cowboys learned that shelter wasn't just about walls and roofs. It was about people, proximity, and the difficult art of enduring together. You lie awake longer than you want to, listening. Winter camps have a soundscape all their own, and once you notice it, you can't stop. The wind doesn't just blow, it searches. It probes edges, tests seams, whispers through cracks. Cowboys learned to read these sounds the way sailors read waves. Noise meant information. Inside the shelter, every material answers differently. Brush size, canvas snaps. Wood creaks and pops. Sod barely speaks at all. Each sound tells you how the shelter is holding. Cowboys woke instantly to unfamiliar noises, not out of fear, but habit. Change meant danger. Familiar rhythms meant rest, at least for now. You hear ice forming. It sounds like faint ticking, a quiet crackle as moisture freezes and contracts. Cowboys recognized that sound too. It meant temperatures were dropping fast. Nights often grew colder after midnight, not warmer. Shelters that felt adequate at dusk sometimes failed hours later. Listening bought time to adjust. There's a quirky historical detail buried in winter diaries that mentions men tapping shelter walls with knuckles or tools to judge stiffness. A solid thud meant frozen and stable. A hollow rattle meant shifting or collapse risk. Sound replaced sight in the dark. Winter sharpened senses. Outside, animals contribute their own signals. Cattle move restlessly before storms. Horses stamp and snort when wind shifts suddenly. Wolves howl more clearly in cold air, their voices travelling farther than expected. Cowboys used these sounds as weather warnings long before forecasts existed. When animals acted uneasy, shelters got reinforced. You hear your own body too. The rustle of blankets, teeth clicking if you misjudge insulation, breath sounding too loud in enclosed spaces. Cowboys learned to monitor themselves as carefully as shelters. Shivering meant heat loss. Silence meant sleep, or something worse. Winter turned self-awareness into survival skill. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether cowboys slept deeply in winter or only in fragments. Some accounts describe long, heavy sleep born of exhaustion. Others mention constant waking to tend fires or check vents. Likely both happened. Winter sleep followed no consistent pattern. It bent to necessity. You notice how time stretches at night. Darkness feels longer, heavier. Cowboys measured hours by sensations rather than clocks. How stiff joints felt. How often the fire needed tending. How many times the wind changed voice. Shelter became the frame through which time passed. A fringe anecdote from a Colorado camp claims cowboys once mistook the groaning of a log cabin for approaching riders and nearly fled into a blizzard. While the story may be embellished, it reflects a truth. Winter sounds confused even experienced men. Fatigue and cold blurred perception. Shelter sounds could deceive. You adjust your position slightly, listening to the change. The shelter answers back. A small shift reduces a draft. A blanket pressed tighter muffles a hiss. Cowboys made micro-adjustments constantly, often half asleep. Survival didn't pause for rest. It simply slowed. There's a historical fact tied to winter accidents that often goes unnoticed. Many injuries occurred at night inside shelters. Burns from fires, crushed fingers from shifting walls, suffocation from blocked vents. Darkness magnified risk. Cowboys learned to move carefully, deliberately, even when half-conscious. Outside, the wind rises again, but this time it sounds distant, fragmented. Snowbanking has done its job. The shelter absorbs the sound instead of amplifying it. Cowboys took comfort in that muffling. It meant winter was working harder than they were. You hear someone cough in a nearby shelter, a sound that carries far in cold air. Illness travelled quickly in winter camps, and sound announced it early. Cowboys paid attention to coughing, hoarseness, silence where sound should be. Health monitoring began with listening. As hours pass, the soundscape shifts subtly. Wind slows, ice settles, animals quiet. This often meant colder temperatures but calmer conditions. Cowboys learned that the quietest hours were sometimes the most dangerous. Cold without wind crept deeper. Shelters needed to be tight, insulation intact. You listen to the shelter breathe. Air moves slowly, deliberately, not stagnant, not rushing. This balance mattered. Cowboys learned to adjust vents by sound alone, feeling for changes in pressure and tone. Shelter management became almost musical. There's an emotional aspect to this listening that cowboys rarely articulated. Sound anchored them to the present. In long winter nights, listening kept the mind from wandering too far into loneliness or fear. Shelter sounds became companions, reminders that something stood between you and nothing. Eventually exhaustion wins small victories. You drift in and out of sleep, guided by the shelter's steady responses. When something shifts, you wake. When it holds, you rest. Winter sleep was never complete. It was negotiated. In the Old West, the sounds of winter shelters told stories no books recorded. They spoke of strain, resilience, and constant adjustment. Cowboys who learned to listen survived longer than those who tried to ignore winter's voice. As dawn begins its slow return, the shelter still answers when tested. The sounds soften, settle, and you realize you've made it through another night. Not by fighting the cold, but by hearing it, understanding it, and responding before it could take more than you were willing to give. You learn that blizzards don't just test shelters, they redesign them. After every major storm, cowboys adjusted how they built, where they built, and what they trusted. Winter storms weren't lessons you studied afterward. They were instructions delivered at full volume, and ignoring them meant you didn't get a second chance. The sky changes first, not dramatically but subtly. Light flattens, distance collapses, landmarks soften at the edges. Cowboys learned to recognize this visual warning long before snow fell. When blizzards came fast, shelter decisions had to be immediate. You didn't search for the perfect place, you chose the least bad option and committed. Blizzards taught cowboys that height was a liability. Tall shelters caught wind and collapsed. High ground exposed everything. After enough storms, winter camps crept lower, into draws, against banks, near cut hillsides. That's a historical fact reflected in how shelter remains cluster in low terrain rather than ridgelines. Blizzards punished elevation. You brace the shelter as wind begins to roar. Snow doesn't fall straight. It moves sideways, driven like sand. Cowboys learned that blizzard snow wasn't about accumulation. It was about pressure. Snow packed into cracks, froze solid, and pried structures apart from the inside. After storms, shelters showed scars where snow had forced its way through weak points. There's a quirky detail in storm accounts where cowboys described snow sounding like gravel, thrown against walls. That wasn't exaggeration. Wind-packed ice pellets hit with real force. Shelters needed angled surfaces to deflect that energy. Flat walls took the hit directly. After enough blizzards, angled construction became instinct. You reinforce corners first. Corners failed more often than walls. Wind found them, twisted them, worked them loose. Cowboys began rounding corners with snow, brush or sod whenever possible. Rounded shapes resisted pressure better. It's why dugouts and snowbanked shelters survived storms that flattened square structures. Blizzards also rewrote rules about entrances. Doors facing any direction but downwind became liabilities. Snow piled fast, sealing exits completely. Cowboys learned to build secondary exits, or keep digging tools inside shelters. That's a historical fact found in storm survival accounts. Men trapped inches from open air without tools didn't last long. You hear stories of shelters discovered after storms with entrances buried 6 feet deep, occupants suffocated despite solid construction. These weren't weak shelters, they were sealed ones. Blizzards taught cowboys that airflow mattered even more during storms than during cold snaps. Air was life. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether blizzards pushed cowboys toward more communal sheltering. Some argue storms forced men together for mutual digging and survival. Others point out that crowded shelters during blizzards increased suffocation risk. The truth depended on preparation. Shared shelters worked only if someone stayed awake. You take turns watching. Blizzards erase day and night, turning time into noise and pressure. Cowboys rotated watches not just for fire but for walls. Snow had to be cleared constantly. Roofs had to be checked. A shelter unattended for hours could collapse silently. A fringe account from South Dakota describes cowboys tying themselves together with rope inside a dugout during a blizzard so no one could wander out disoriented. While dramatic, it reflects a real danger. Whiteout conditions erased orientation completely. Men stepped outside to relieve themselves and vanished 10 feet from shelter. Blizzards changed attitudes toward mobility. Before storms, cowboys prized the ability to move quickly. After surviving a few blizzards, they prioritized anchors. Shelters became heavier, more fixed, more defensive. Winter demanded commitment. Once you chose a shelter in a storm, leaving it was often deadlier than staying. You feel how sound disappears in a blizzard. Wind overwhelms everything. Shelters creak and strain. but those sounds get swallowed instantly. Cowboys described blizzards as isolating even within group shelters. You could be surrounded by men and feel utterly alone. Communication became touch-based. Hand squeezes, shared tasks, physical presence. There's a historical fact tied to shelter design shifts after major blizzards. Fire use dropped during peak storms. Flames drew air too aggressively, pulling snow inward and increasing collapse risk. Cowboys banked fires low or extinguished them entirely, relying on insulation and body heat instead. Warmth took a backseat to stability. After the storm passes, shelters tell the story. Walls bowed inward, roofs sagged, snow fused into ice armour around structures. Cowboys studied this damage carefully. They didn't repair blindly. They asked why something failed. Blizzards were teachers, and the tuition was high. You shovel your way out into a reshaped world, fences gone, landmarks erased, trails buried. But the shelter still stands, altered but alive. Cowboys often rebuilt immediately after storms, reinforcing based on fresh evidence. Winter improvement cycles happened fast because the next storm was never far away. There's debate among historians about whether the most effective shelter designs were intentional or emergent, discovered through repeated failure rather than planning. Blizzard patterns suggest the latter. Cowboys didn't design for blizzards initially. They survived them, then adapted. Shelter evolution was reactive, not theoretical. Emotionally, blizzards stripped confidence. Men who rode hard all summer found themselves powerless against weather. Surviving storms humbled even the toughest hands. Afterward, cowboys respected shelters differently, not as conveniences, but as allies that had proven themselves under pressure. As you settle back inside after reinforcing again, the shelter feels heavier, quieter, more serious. It has scars now, and so do you. Blizzards didn't just test materials, they tested judgment, patience, and restraint. In the Old West, every major storm quietly rewrote the rules of winter survival. Cowboys who paid attention lived longer. Those who trusted yesterday's shelter without adjustment often didn't. As the wind finally fades and the world exhales, you understand something winter taught relentlessly. Shelters weren't built once. They were built again and again, each time shaped by the last storm that tried to tear them apart. You hear about the die-offs long before you see their aftermath. Cowboys spoke of them quietly, without drama, because exaggeration wasn't needed. Winters bad enough to erase herds and men alike left scars on memory that didn't fade. These weren't isolated incidents. They were turning points that reshaped how shelters were built, where camps were placed, and what risks were no longer tolerated. The Great Die-Up of 1886–87 hangs over every winter decision like a ghost. That's a historical fact no discussion of cowboy winter survival can avoid. An estimated hundreds of thousands of cattle died across the northern plains, along with countless horses and an unrecorded number of men. Snow piled high, temperatures plunged, and open-range assumptions collapsed under the weight of reality. You imagine being there, weeks of unbroken cold, grass locked beneath ice, cattle drifting with the wind until they collapsed. Cowboys followed them, building shelters where they could, often too late. Many winter camps were overwhelmed, not because they were poorly built, but because the scale of the disaster exceeded anything men had planned for. Shelter design had limits. Winter sometimes exceeded them. Die-offs taught cowboys that proximity to resources mattered more than tradition. Camps once placed for convenience or habit moved closer to timber, water, and natural windbreaks. That's a historical shift visible in ranch maps after severe winters. Survival replaced routine. Shelters followed resources, not pride. You hear stories of cowboys digging emergency shelters in snowbanks, while blizzards still raged, crawling inside with frozen hands and numbed thoughts. Some survived, some didn't. These accounts appear fragmented in letters and oral histories, often told without names. Winter. Disasters erased individuality. What remained were lessons. There's a quirky detail from die-off narratives where men described shelters filled with cattle bodies stacked as windbreaks. Grim? Yes, but effective. Frozen mass blocked wind better than brush. It's a fringe fact that sounds unthinkable until you understand the conditions. Winter demanded brutal practicality. The psychological toll of die-offs changed shelter behaviour too. Cowboys who survived extreme winters became more conservative. They built heavier. They chose lower ground. They stocked extra insulation. Risk tolerance dropped. Younger hands sometimes mocked this caution until their first bad winter taught them otherwise. There's ongoing debate among historians about whether die-offs were primarily failures of planning or unavoidable acts of nature. Some argue ranchers underestimated climate variability and paid the price. Others point out that weather extremes exceeded historical norms. Shelter evidence suggests both. Camps improved after disasters, but even improved shelters sometimes failed. You notice that after major die-offs, communal shelters became more common temporarily. Men clustered together for morale and labour efficiency. Digging, banking and reinforcing took more hands than one man could provide. Winter survival became collective work again, at least until confidence slowly returned. A fringe anecdote from Montana claims that after a devastating winter, some cowboys refused to sleep under canvas ever again, no matter the conditions. While impossible to verify broadly, it reflects a psychological shift. Survivors associated certain shelter types with trauma. Preference became emotional as much as practical. Die-offs also changed how cowboys talked about shelter success. Before, survival was credited to toughness or luck. After, men talked about placement, insulation, and airflow. Language shifted from bravado to specifics. Winter forced professionalism. You walk through abandoned camps in spring, collapsed brush shelters, half-buried dugouts, sod walls slumped back into earth. These ruins told stories. Cowboys studied them carefully. Where did snow pile? Where did wind cut hardest? Where did shelters last longest? Failure became instruction. There's a historical fact often overlooked. Many die-off winters resulted in permanent changes to ranching infrastructure. Line camps evolved from temporary shelters into more solid cabins. Investment increased because loss demanded it. Shelter budgets rose. Winter forced economics to acknowledge reality. You feel the weight of those lessons in every reinforced wall and banked drift. Shelters built after disasters carried memory in their design. Extra vents, secondary exits, lower profiles, heavier roofs. Winter history was embedded in construction choices. Emotionally, die-offs humbled men. Survivors rarely spoke of victory. They spoke of endurance. Shelter became something to respect, not just use. Cowboys learned that winter didn't care how skilled you were. It cared how prepared you stayed. As you settle into a shelter shaped by past failures, you understand that many of its features exist because someone else didn't survive without them. Every angled wall and narrowed entrance carries inherited knowledge. Winter survival was cumulative, paid for over decades. In the Old West, brutal winters didn't just kill cattle and men. They rewrote the rules of shelter. Cowboys who listened adapted. Those who didn't disappeared quietly, leaving behind empty camps and unanswered questions buried under spring grass. As the night closes in again, you feel the shelter hold firm, not just against cold, but against history's harshest reminders. You're not safer because winter softened. You're safer because others endured, failed, and taught without ever meaning to. You begin to notice that not all winter knowledge on the range originated with cowboys. Much of what kept men alive had been practiced for generations by indigenous peoples long before cattle arrived. Cowboys borrowed quietly, often without acknowledgement, because winter didn't care where ideas came from. It only cared whether they worked. Shelter placement was one of the first lessons adopted. Indigenous groups understood wind patterns, seasonal movement, and thermal advantages of landforms intimately. Cowboys watched, asked questions indirectly, and copied what they saw succeed. That's a historical fact supported by journals noting Indian-style camps or native placement, without much elaboration. Survival often spread through observation, not instruction. You recognize techniques now: low profiles, rounded shapes, entrances angled away from prevailing winds. These weren't accidental. Plains tribes built lodges that resisted wind and shed snow effectively. Cowboys adapted those principles using available materials. They couldn't replicate cultural forms exactly, but they adopted the physics behind them. Snow use stands out most clearly. Indigenous snow shelters and snowbank structures demonstrated that cold materials could insulate when used correctly. Cowboys learned this through proximity and experience. There's evidence that some winter camps mirrored indigenous snow management almost exactly, from vent placement to drift shaping. Winter rewarded imitation. You notice the emphasis on ventilation. Indigenous shelters balanced warmth and airflow carefully, something cowboys initially struggled with. Over time, they learned to leave controlled openings and manage smoke intelligently. Many of the fire placement techniques cowboys used resemble indigenous practices closely, though rarely credited as such. There's a quirky historical detail in some frontier accounts describing cowboys adopting the practice of covering entrances with layered hides or blankets that could be adjusted easily. This flexible ceiling appears in indigenous shelters as well. Rigid doors failed in winter. Adjustable barriers succeeded. There's ongoing debate among historians about how much direct teaching occurred versus silent borrowing. Some argue cowboys learned primarily through observation, while others suggest more direct exchanges took place during trade or shared camps. Evidence exists for both. Winter survival likely blurred cultural boundaries more than summer work ever did. You think about dugouts and earth shelters differently now. Indigenous earth lodges use similar principles: mass, insulation and stability. Cowboys simplified these ideas into quick, functional versions. They lacked ceremonial elements, but the core logic remained. Go into the earth, and winter loses strength. A fringe anecdote from the northern plains claims some cowboys learned to read snow quality, powder versus crust, by watching indigenous travellers choose routes. This knowledge influenced shelter decisions too. Powder insulated better. Crust reflected cold differently. Snow was not uniform. Understanding it mattered. You see how winter forced humility. Cowboys who dismissed indigenous knowledge didn't last long. Those who paid attention adapted faster. Shelter design became a quiet space where cultural borrowing happened without pride or credit. Survival demanded it. There's a historical fact often overlooked. Many indigenous winter shelters outperformed settler designs in severe conditions, yet were dismissed in popular narratives as primitive. Cowboys who experienced both knew better. Effectiveness, not appearance, decided survival. Psychologically, borrowing knowledge softened winter's isolation. Cowboys realized they weren't the first to face these conditions. Others had solved similar problems long ago. That realization mattered. It reframed winter from an enemy to be fought into a system to be understood. You adapt techniques without fully realizing their origin, banking snow, shaping entrances, managing airflow intuitively. Knowledge migrates quietly through practice. Cowboys didn't need theory. They needed results. There's debate among scholars about whether this borrowing influenced long-term cowboy identity. Some argue it created a more pragmatic, less myth-driven culture. Others claim it remained surface level, limited to survival situations. Shelter evidence suggests pragmatism won whenever winter pressed hard enough. You adjust your shelter again, unconsciously applying principles refined over centuries. Rounded snowbanks, controlled vents, low profile, efficient insulation. Winter knowledge accumulates invisibly, passed hand to hand, season to season. As night deepens, you feel gratitude. Not romantic, not sentimental, but practical. Survival rarely belonged to one culture alone. It was shared, adapted, and refined by whoever needed it most. In the Old West, cowboy winter shelters were not purely cowboy inventions. They were hybrids, part necessity, part borrowed wisdom. And in that blending, many men found the margins they needed to survive winters that otherwise would have erased them. As you settle in, sheltered by ideas older than the range itself, you understand something winter made clear. Innovation often begins with listening. And the land had been speaking long before cowboys learned how to hear it. You find out quickly that winter rarely gives you ideal materials. More often, it gives you nothing you planned for and demands solutions anyway. Improvisation wasn't a bonus skill for cowboys. It was the core of winter survival. When shelters failed or supplies ran out, creativity decided outcomes. You look around and inventory what's left. A broken wagon side, a bent shovel, spare tack, old fencing wire. Cowboys learned to see objects not for what they were but for what they could become. Winter stripped away original purpose. Everything became potential shelter material. When wood ran out, cowboys turned to whatever blocked wind. Saddles stacked on their sides became walls. Harness hung thickly enough slowed drafts. Even bedrolls, when sacrificed, could plug gaps long enough to save a night. These weren't choices made lightly. Using bedding as structure meant colder sleep later. Winter forced hard trade-offs. There's a historical fact buried in ranch correspondence that mentions line camps dismantling corrals plank by plank during extreme cold. Livestock were moved or lost, but the wood saved men. Shelter took priority over property. Winter reordered values quickly. You see how wire, normally useless for warmth, suddenly matters. Strung tightly, it held brush in place. Twisted into frames, it supported canvas or hides. Cowboys became amateur engineers under pressure. Shelter improvisation demanded structure as much as insulation. There's a quirky detail from winter accounts where cowboys described weaving grass mats by hand to line shelters. It was slow, miserable work with numb fingers, but it added crucial insulation. The practice resembles indigenous techniques again, though adapted hurriedly. Winter rewarded even crude craftsmanship. You watch moisture carefully. Improvised shelters failed fastest when they trapped dampness. Cowboys learned to prioritize dryness over thickness. A thin, dry wall beat a thick, wet one. This lesson appears repeatedly in survival stories, men freezing in heavy shelters soaked by meltwater. There's an ongoing debate among historians about whether improvisation saved more lives than preparation. Some argue well-stocked camps mattered most. Others point out that preparation rarely matched reality. Improvisation bridged the gap. Evidence suggests both mattered, but improvisation decided emergencies. You think about fringe stories, cowboys burning wagon wheels for heat, tearing pages from books to plug drafts, even sacrificing boots to seal holes. These stories sound extreme, but they appear across regions. Winter reduced possessions to functions. Sentimentality froze quickly. Improvisation also changed how cowboys worked together. Crisis erased hierarchy. Whoever had an idea spoke. Whoever could tie, stack, or brace worked. Shelter building became collective problem-solving, fast and blunt. Winter rewarded speed over elegance. You test an improvised wall and feel it hold, barely. That's often all winter allowed. Shelters didn't need to be good. They needed to be good enough. Cowboys learned to recognize that threshold intuitively. Overbuilding wasted energy. Underbuilding killed. There's a historical fact tied to winter camps that still surprises people. Some improvised shelters outperformed permanent ones because they responded directly to conditions. Built quickly for specific storms, they matched wind direction and snow load better than generic structures. Customization mattered. Psychologically, improvisation kept despair at bay. Doing something, anything, restored agency. Cowboys wrote about feeling calmer once they began building, even if the shelter was crude. Action pushed back against winter's overwhelming scale. You adjust again, adding one more layer, one more brace. Each small improvement stacks. Winter survival wasn't about perfect solutions, it was about cumulative resistance. Cowboys survived by refusing to accept the first failure as final. There's debate among scholars about whether this improvisational mindset influenced broader cowboy culture. Some argue it fostered independence and adaptability myths. Others say it simply reflected necessity. In winter shelters, myth didn't matter. Results did. As night falls, you sit inside something that didn't exist hours ago, built from scraps and stubbornness. It smells wrong, looks wrong, and works just enough. That's winter success. In the Old West, many men survived winters not because they had the right shelter, but because they built something when nothing seemed possible. Improvisation filled the gaps left by planning, supply, and luck. You lean back, listening to the shelter hold against the wind, and realize winter never demanded perfection. It demanded response. Cowboys who responded creatively lived longer than those who waited for ideal conditions that never came. You start to understand that cold alone rarely killed cowboys. Moisture did the quiet work. Wet boots, damp bedding, condensation dripping unseen through the night. These were the real assassins of winter camps. Cowboys feared being wet more than being cold, because wet cold stole heat faster than the body could replace it. You kneel and check the shelter floor first. Earth sweats, snow melts, breath condenses and falls back down. Cowboys learned that the ground was never neutral. If you slept directly on it, it pulled warmth from you hour after hour. That's a historical fact repeated in winter survival accounts. Men froze from below even when sheltered from wind. Raising bedding became essential. Poles, brush, saddles, even stacked gear created just enough separation to slow heat loss. Cowboys built crude bunks whenever possible, not for comfort, but for dryness. Air beneath you mattered as much as air around you. You inspect the roof next. Drips were unacceptable. A single drip soaking a blanket could cascade into shivering exhaustion and poor judgment. Cowboys learned to test shelters during midday thaws, watching where meltwater travelled. They fixed leaks before night returned. Moisture management was proactive or fatal. Canvas shelters were the worst offenders. Fabric trapped condensation, turning breath into frost that later melted. Cowboys wiped walls constantly, shook tarps, adjusted vents. A dry canvas shelter was rare. A managed one was survivable. Winter demanded constant attention. There's a quirky historical detail that mentions cowboys sprinkling ash or dry soil on damp floors to absorb moisture. Ash pulled water from the air and ground alike. It wasn't pleasant, but it worked. Winter didn't reward cleanliness. It rewarded function. You notice how fire complicates moisture. Heat melts snow on roofs and walls, creating drips. Then the fire dies, and everything refreezes harder than before. Cowboys learned to regulate fire intensity carefully, trading peak warmth for stability. A steady low heat kept moisture predictable. There's an ongoing debate among historians about whether moisture control mattered more than insulation thickness. Some argue the warmest shelters failed because they were wet. Others point out that thin shelters could succeed if kept dry. Evidence suggests dryness often mattered more. Cold could be endured. Dampness accelerated defeat. You think about boots. Wet feet ended careers and lives. Cowboys dried boots obsessively, near fires, inside coats, stuffed with dry grass. Sleeping with boots inside shelters wasn't luxury. It was necessity. Frozen boots in the morning meant frostbite before daylight. A fringe anecdote from a Wyoming camp claims cowboys slept with socks tucked inside their shirts to dry from body heat. It sounds miserable, but plausible. Wool dried slowly but retained warmth. Every dry layer mattered. You adjust ventilation again, balancing airflow to carry moisture out without inviting wind in. This balance was one of the hardest skills to master. Cowboys learned it by failure. Too little airflow meant dampness. Too much meant cold. Winter demanded precision. You listened for drips, for subtle changes in sound. Moisture announced itself quietly. Cowboys trained themselves to hear it. A drip at midnight was more dangerous than a howl outside. Inside threats killed faster. There's a historical fact tied to winter sickness that reinforces this. Prolonged damp exposure led to pneumonia and fevers that shelters couldn't fix. Dry shelters reduced illness dramatically. Moisture management extended survival beyond individual nights. Psychologically, dryness restored morale. Damp camps felt oppressive, hopeless. Dry ones felt manageable. Cowboys often wrote that a dry night made winter bearable, even when temperatures were brutal. Shelter success was measured in dryness as much as warmth. You sit back and feel the air inside the shelter. Cool, but dry enough. That's a win. Winter wins when it soaks you. You win when it doesn't. As night settles again, you understand why experienced cowboys obsessed over moisture. They didn't brag about warm shelters. They bragged about dry ones. Dry meant tomorrow was possible. In the Old West, the battle against winter wasn't fought only against cold winds and snowdrifts. It was fought drop by drop, breath by breath, against moisture that crept in quietly. Cowboys who learned to keep themselves and their shelters dry outlasted storms that claimed stronger men. You lie down, bedding dry beneath you, air moving just enough, and feel the cold pause. Not retreat. Pause. That pause was everything. Morning arrives reluctantly, filtered through frost and fatigue. You wake stiff, joints protesting as if they belong to someone older. The first movement is always the hardest. Cowboys used to joke that winter mornings aged you 10 years overnight, and then gave some of it back by noon if you were lucky. Survival wasn't measured by comfort. It was measured by whether you could still stand up. You sit slowly and test your hands, flexing fingers until feeling returns. Numbness fading is a good sign. Pain returning is better. Cowboys learned to welcome pain because it meant circulation. Frostbite announced itself quietly, often without drama, and mornings were when you checked for it. Ears, toes, fingers. Winter demanded daily inventories of your own body. Inside the shelter, everything feels smaller in daylight. Walls that felt solid at night look thin and temporary. That's a psychological trick Winter plays. Darkness magnifies danger, but daylight exposes fragility. Cowboys learned not to be discouraged by that morning reveal. The shelter didn't need to look strong. It needed to have worked. You take stock of the air first. Is it stale, smoky, damp? A good shelter morning smells like earth, wool, and faint ash. Not rot, not mildew. Cowboys judged shelter success in seconds with their senses. If the air felt wrong, something needed fixing before the day's work began. There's a historical fact buried in winter camp routines that surprises many people. Mornings were often busier than evenings. Cowboys used daylight warmth to repair shelters aggressively. Walls thickened, roofs adjusted, snowbanks reshaped. Evening was for rest. Morning was for reinforcement. Winter punished procrastination. You step outside and feel how the cold bites differently now. Overnight cold settles deep, but morning cold is sharper, more brittle. Snow crunches louder. Wind feels cleaner. Cowboys recognized this as working cold. Better for moving, worse for stillness. Morning was when tasks happened. You circle the shelter, studying how it handled the night. Where did snow pile? Where did wind scour clean? Where did moisture collect? These signs told stories. Cowboys read them carefully. A drift here meant wind protection. A bare patch there meant exposure. Shelter improvement followed evidence, not theory. There's a quirky detail from winter journals where men describe tapping frozen snowbanks like masonry, listening for hollowness that indicated weak packing. Solid snow sounded dull and heavy. Weak snow sounded thin. Cowboys treated snow like building material because it was. Winter forced new definitions of structure. You clear vents carefully, opening airflow without inviting drafts. Morning was the safest time to do this. If something went wrong, you had daylight to fix it. Cowboys rarely made major shelter changes at night unless absolutely necessary. Darkness magnified mistakes. Breakfast is simple, often cold. Cooking waited. Movement came first. Cowboys warmed themselves through work rather than fire when possible. Fire was saved for evenings or emergencies. Morning activity generated heat and restored flexibility. Winter favoured motion. You notice how shelter maintenance affected morale. Fixing something tangible restored confidence. Cowboys who ignored shelters felt hunted by winter. Those who improved them felt engaged, even hopeful. Shelter work wasn't just physical, it was psychological armour. There's an ongoing debate among historians about whether morning routines in winter camps were formalised or improvised. Some accounts describe strict schedules, others suggest loose rhythms guided by weather and fatigue. Shelter evidence points to consistency without rigidity. Certain tasks happened daily because winter demanded them. You check bedding, shaking out frost, airing it briefly despite the cold. Cowboys knew that airing bedding prevented moisture buildup even when temperatures were brutal. Sunlight mattered. Ultraviolet light killed smells and dampness. A few minutes outside made nights safer. A fringe anecdote from Idaho claims cowboys sometimes laid bedding directly on snow for short periods to dry it, believing the cold pulled moisture out. Scientifically, sublimation could occur in dry conditions. Whether intentional or accidental, the practice appears in multiple regions. Winter bred counterintuitive solutions. You repair a loose section of wall and feel the satisfaction of small improvements. One more layer, one tighter angle. Cowboys survived winter by stacking marginal gains. No single fix saved them. Accumulated fixes did. There's a historical fact tied to winter mornings that often goes unnoticed. Many accidents happened right after waking. Cold-stiffened bodies made mistakes with tools, fires, and footing. Cowboys learned to move deliberately at first, warming gradually. Rushing killed. You paused to watch the sun climb slightly higher. Even in winter, daylight brought subtle changes. Shadows shifted, surfaces softened. Cowboys timed tasks around these micro windows of advantage. Shelters were adjusted when materials were most cooperative: snow-packable, earth-workable, fabric pliable. As midday approaches, you retreat briefly into the shelter to feel the difference. It's warmer now, but more importantly, it's dry and stable. That's success. Cowboys measured shelter quality by how it improved between night and day, not how it looked on arrival. Psychologically, mornings reset fear. Night magnified uncertainty. Morning reduced it to problems. Problems could be addressed. Cowboys who made it through the night often felt a quiet confidence return with daylight. Not arrogance, relief. There's debate among scholars about whether winter survival was more physical or mental. Morning routines suggest both were inseparable. Maintaining shelters maintained morale. Morale preserved judgment. Judgment preserved life. You pack away tools and make notes mentally for evening. Winter demanded foresight. What would drop in temperature? Where would snow drift? Shelters were built for tonight, but improved for tomorrow. Cowboys lived one night ahead at all times. As you finish your morning circuit, you realize something subtle but important. Surviving the night wasn't the end of winter work. It was the beginning of the day's responsibility. Shelters that saved you once had to be earned again. In the Old West, winter mornings defined endurance. They were moments of assessment, repair, and recommitment. Cowboys who treated mornings seriously lived longer than those who celebrated survival and moved on. You step back inside, shelter, holding steady behind you, and feel the day begin. Not warm, not easy, but manageable. And in winter, manageable was victory enough. You learn that shelters didn't just protect bodies, they protected minds. Winter isolation gnawed at cowboys in ways the cold alone never could. Long nights, short days, endless white horizons stripped stimulation down to nothing. Shelter became a psychological boundary as much as a physical one, a line between you and the vastness trying to swallow your thoughts. Inside a shelter, time behaved differently. Outside, hours blurred together under grey skies. Inside, moments gained structure. Fire cycles, maintenance tasks, shared meals or solitary routines. Cowboys relied on these rhythms to stay oriented. Losing track of time in winter was dangerous. It led to skipped meals, neglected fires, and poor decisions. You sit quietly and notice how the shelter narrows your focus. The world shrinks to walls, breath, and sound. That narrowing is a relief. Cowboys often described winter as mentally overwhelming until they were inside shelter. Once enclosed, the mind calmed. Problems became local instead of infinite. There's a historical fact buried in letters from winter camps that speaks volumes. Many cowboys wrote more during winter than any other season. When shelters provided enough stability, men wrote journals, letters home, even poetry. Writing wasn't boredom, it was grounding. Shelter gave the mind permission to wander safely. You notice how shelters created a sense of ownership. Even temporary ones felt personal. Cowboys arranged gear deliberately, hung items in consistent places, marked walls. These rituals weren't vanity, they were anchors. Familiar layouts reduced anxiety in environments that offered few constants. Isolation hit hardest during prolonged storms. Days passed without visual change. Cowboys trapped in shelters during blizzards described a creeping unreality, where silence and noise blurred together. Shelter walls helped contain that mental drift. They reminded men where they ended and winter began. There's an ongoing debate among historians about how common seasonal depression was among cowboys. Some argue the work kept men too busy to dwell on mood. Others point to descriptions of lethargy, irritability, and hopelessness during long winters. Shelter evidence supports the latter. Men invested heavily in improving shelters when morale dipped. You think about group shelters again. Shared space reduced loneliness but introduced friction. Arguments flared faster in winter. Small annoyances grew large in confinement. Cowboys learned conflict management unintentionally, giving space when possible, staying quiet when tempers rose. Shelter etiquette evolved out of necessity. There's a quirky detail from winter camps where men assign themselves silent hours, especially at night. No talking, no singing, just presence. It wasn't written rule, but it appears in multiple accounts. Silence calmed nerves and reduced conflict. Shelter demanded emotional discipline. You realize how much waiting winter involved. Waiting for storms to pass, waiting for daylight, waiting for temperature shifts. Shelters framed that waiting. Without them, waiting felt like exposure. With them, waiting became endurance instead of fear. A fringe anecdote from a Nebraska camp claims cowboys carved playing pieces from bone and wood during winter holds, inventing games to pass time. While details vary, makeshift games appear across regions. Shelter made play possible. Play preserved sanity. You feel how shelter limits sensory input. Wind dulls, light softens, sounds become predictable. This sensory dampening reduced stress. Cowboys who slept under open sky during winter described heightened anxiety, constant alertness, and exhaustion. Enclosed shelter allowed true rest. There's a historical fact tied to winter injuries that reinforces this. Accidents dropped when shelters improved. Fatigue impaired judgment. Shelter reduced fatigue. Reduced fatigue reduced mistakes. Mental protection translated directly into physical survival. You notice how shelter walls absorbed not just sound, but fear. Outside, winter felt intentional, almost predatory. Inside, it felt mechanical. Wind, cold, snow doing what they always did. Removing perceived intent reduced panic. Cowboys rarely articulated this, but their behaviour reflected it. There's debate among scholars about whether winter shelters fostered introspection or merely distracted from hardship. Diaries suggest both. Some men confronted loneliness and doubt. Others buried themselves in routine. Shelter didn't dictate mental outcomes, but it created space for them. You adjust something small inside the shelter, a strap, a tool, a blanket, and feel control return. Control mattered psychologically. Winter stripped agency constantly. Shelter restored bits of it. Cowboys survived mentally by reclaiming control wherever possible. You think about the men who refused shelters entirely, choosing open exposure out of pride or habit. Some survived. Many didn't. Those who did often paid mental costs, hypervigilance, insomnia, emotional numbness. Shelter offered balance. It let the mind stand down occasionally. There's a historical fact tied to post-winter behaviour that's telling. Many cowboys rode harder, took more risks and sought noise and company intensely once spring arrived. Winter confinement built pressure. Shelter made it survivable, but release was still necessary. As night approaches again, you feel less dread than before. Familiarity replaces fear. The shelter has proven itself. That proof calms the mind. Cowboys trusted shelters that had survived storms. Trust reduced anxiety. Reduced anxiety preserved energy. You lie back and let the shelter hold the edges of your awareness. Winter presses outside, but it doesn't intrude fully. Thoughts slow. Breathing evens out. This is mental shelter in its purest form. In the Old West, surviving winter required more than blocking wind and cold. It required managing the mind through long stretches of waiting, isolation, and uncertainty. Shelters did that work quietly, invisibly. Cowboys who understood this treated shelters with respect beyond their physical value. They fixed them not just to stay warm, but to stay steady. And in a season that tested resolve as fiercely as endurance, that steadiness was often what kept men alive until spring finally returned. You begin to realize that even now, long after the last trail drive faded, people still argue about what kind of winter shelter worked best. Historians, archaeologists, and survival experts circle the same question. Was it earth, wood, snow, or improvisation that saved the most lives? Cowboys never settled the debate because winter never allowed one answer to win everywhere. The sod versus log argument comes up first. Sod houses insulated better and resisted wind, but they were damp, dark, and psychologically heavy. Log cabins were drier and brighter, but drafty and fuel-hungry. Historical records show cowboys praising both and cursing both, sometimes in the same winter. Preference often depended less on physics and more on tolerance. You see the same disagreement around dugouts. Some historians argue dugouts were superior in extreme cold because Earth stabilized temperature so effectively. Others point out the risks: flooding, collapse, poor air quality. Cowboy accounts support both sides. Dugouts saved lives in blizzards and killed men during thaws. Context decided everything. Snow shelters provoke the most skepticism. Modern readers struggle to accept snow as protection. Yet survival accounts, archaeological evidence, and repeated use suggest snowbanking and even full snow cover worked when managed carefully. The debate centres on reliability. Snow shelters demanded constant attention. When neglected, they became lethal. You notice that canvas shelters rarely win any argument. Most scholars agree canvas was a stopgap, not a solution. Still, some cowboys survived entire winters under tarps by combining placement, insulation, and vigilance. Canvas didn't fail automatically. It failed when treated casually. Winter punished casual shelter choices. There's an ongoing argument about whether shelter design or shelter placement mattered more. Some researchers emphasize material science, insulation values, airflow, mass. Others argue placement dominated everything. Evidence suggests placement often outweighed materials. A poor site ruined good construction. A good site rescued bad materials. You think about wind again. Almost every debate circles back to it. Shelters that controlled wind performed better, regardless of material. Cowboys who mastered wind reading outlived those who obsessed over thickness alone. Winter wasn't uniform cold, it was moving cold. Another scholarly debate centres on whether cowboy shelters evolved meaningfully over time or remained static. Archaeological layers suggest gradual improvement. Lower profiles, thicker walls, better venting. Diaries confirm this learning curve. Cowboys adapted, but slowly, often paying for lessons with hardship. There's a quirky disagreement among historians about whether cowboys preferred natural shelters over built ones. Some argue rock overhangs and draws were always favoured. Others say cowboys only used them opportunistically. Evidence shows both. Natural shelters were prized when available, but rarely dependable enough to plan around. You notice how these debates often miss something cowboys understood intuitively. Shelter success wasn't binary. It wasn't safe or unsafe. It was marginal. Shelters brought degrees of protection. Enough degrees stacked together meant survival. Too few meant failure. There's a historical fact that complicates all arguments. Many cowboys used multiple shelter types in a single winter: a dugout during storms, canvas while moving, sod during long holds. Survival strategies were flexible, not ideological. Modern debates search for best answers where cowboys accepted shifting ones. You hear disagreement over whether communal shelters were better than solo ones. Some scholars argue shared heat was decisive. Others emphasize disease and suffocation risks. Cowboy behaviour suggests pragmatism. Men grouped when conditions demanded labour and isolation when conditions allowed control. A fringe theory occasionally appears suggesting cowboys exaggerated winter hardships to enhance frontier mythology. Shelter evidence contradicts this. The sheer redundancy, thickness and care in surviving structures point to genuine danger. You don't overbuild unless experience teaches you to. You realise these debates persist because winter survival wasn't standardised. There was no manual, no universal design. Every shelter was a hypothesis tested overnight. Results varied wildly based on weather, terrain, skill and luck. Cowboys didn't argue much about theory, because theory didn't keep you alive at 2 a.m. Results did. If a shelter worked, it was good. If it failed, it was abandoned or fixed. Winter was ruthless peer review. As you sit inside a shelter shaped by many of these choices, you feel the answer settle quietly. No single shelter type was best. The best shelter was the one that fit the moment, the land, and the weather right now. In the Old West, winter survival wasn't about finding the perfect design. It was about staying adaptable enough to change designs when conditions shifted. Cowboys who clung to one solution died defending it. Those who treated shelters as tools, not identities, endured. The debates continue because we want certainty. Cowboys accepted uncertainty as the cost of living where winter ruled. They didn't ask which shelter was best. They asked which one might get them through tonight. And in a season where tonight was always the question that mattered most, that mindset was the most reliable shelter of all. You eventually notice that not every cowboy wanted shelter at all. Even in winter, some men refused walls, roofs, or anything that felt like surrender. They slept under stars wrapped in blankets, horses nearby, faces turned into the wind as if daring it to try harder. To modernize, it looks reckless. To them it felt honest. These men existed in every winter camp. Older hands with scarred knuckles, younger ones trying to prove something, a few simply wired differently. They trusted open sky more than enclosed space. That's a historical fact supported by diaries that mention star sleepers, even during snow season. Winter didn't eliminate pride, it sharpened it. You watch one of them bed down away from the shelters, choosing a slight rise instead of a hollow, positioning his horse between himself and the wind. This wasn't ignorance, it was a different calculation. Open sleepers relied on mobility, awareness, and instinct instead of structure. They accepted colder nights in exchange for control. There's a quirky detail in some winter accounts that mentions men claiming the stars, kept them oriented. Enclosed shelters disoriented them, made time feel wrong. Under open sky, they could track hours by constellations and moon movement. Scientifically unnecessary, psychologically grounding. Winter survival wasn't purely physical. These men often believed shelters made people careless. Inside walls, men slept too deeply, fires burned too long, vents got ignored. Outside, nothing was forgotten. Every gust demanded response. Every temperature drop registered instantly. Vigilance replaced insulation. There's ongoing debate among historians about whether open sleeping was genuinely viable, or mostly bravado remembered selectively. Evidence suggests both. Some men survived entire winters this way. Others died quickly. Survivorship bias colours memory. The ones who lived told stories. The ones who didn't became statistics. You notice that open sleepers chose their nights carefully. Clear skies, low wind, predictable cold. They retreated to shelter during storms or extreme drops. Refusal wasn't absolute, it was conditional. Winter rewarded flexibility even among the stubborn. Horses played a central role here. Open sleepers often positioned themselves against their mounts, using animal bulk to block wind and share heat. That's a historical fact repeated often enough to be credible. Horses tolerated it because survival aligned. Winter forged temporary alliances between species. There's a fringe belief recorded in some camps that sleeping under open sky reduced illness. Enclosed spaces bred coughs and fevers. Fresh air felt safer. While germ theory wasn't understood, the observation had merit. Poorly ventilated shelters did spread sickness. Open air reduced it, at the cost of cold. Psychologically, refusing shelter was a declaration of identity. Some cowboys equated walls with settlement, routine, and loss of freedom. Shelter felt like the first step toward fences and schedules. Open sleeping preserved a sense of independence winter threatened to strip away. You see tension grow around this choice. Sheltered men worry about the risks. Open sleepers dismiss them. Arguments flare. Winter camps were full of these debates, rarely resolved. Survival philosophies weren't unified. Winter tested them all impartially. There's a historical fact tied to trail bosses that's telling. Many forbade open sleeping during severe cold, not out of kindness, but liability. Losing a man meant lost labour and morale. Personal choice bent under collective responsibility. Winter forced authority where summer allowed freedom. You also notice that some men slept outside shelters to protect them. Group shelters needed airflow. Too many bodies trapped moisture and smoke. One man outside reduced risk for the rest. Open sleeping sometimes became sacrifice rather than pride. There's debate among scholars about whether open sleepers influenced shelter design indirectly. Some argue shelters became smaller because some men opted out. Others say open sleeping faded as shelters improved. Evidence suggests both occurred at different times and places. You try it once, lying under open sky on a clear, bitter night. Cold settles immediately, honest and sharp. There's no buffer, no negotiation, just sensation. You understand the appeal. There's clarity here. No false sense of safety, no illusions, but you also understand the cost. Sleep comes in fragments. Muscles stay tense. Energy drains faster. Winter doesn't pause because you're awake. It keeps taking. By morning, the difference is obvious. Sheltered men rise stiff but functional. Open sleepers rise slower, quieter, sometimes limping. They accept that price willingly. Winter survival didn't eliminate choice, it magnified consequences. There's a historical fact that closes the argument for many. Most long-term winter camps eventually discouraged open sleeping as men aged. Youth tolerated exposure. Age accumulated damage. Shelter extended careers. Winter sorted philosophies by longevity. As you step back inside a shelter, you feel the contrast immediately. Air steadies, muscles unclench, the world narrows again. You realize refusing shelter wasn't ignorance. It was a trade. Clarity for endurance. In the Old West, winter allowed many ways to survive, but not all of them were sustainable. Open sleeping preserved identity. Shelter preserved bodies. Cowboys chose based on who they were and how long they planned to last. Some men wanted to survive winter. Others wanted to survive winter without changing. Shelter forced change, and for a few, that price felt higher than the cold itself. You walk the land years later, long after the camps have gone quiet, and still find their traces. Archaeology doesn't shout out here, it whispers. A shallow depression where earth once roofed over a dugout. A ring of stones blackened by fire. A scatter of rusted nails where a cabin stood just long enough to matter. Cowboy winter shelters didn't vanish completely. They sank back into the ground and waited. Archaeologists studying these sites often struggle to identify them at first. Temporary shelters leave subtle signatures. Brush walls rot. Canvas disappears. Snow leaves nothing at all. What remains are patterns. Soil compaction. Ash layers. Displaced stone. These clues tell stories without words. Winter camps reveal themselves only to those who know what to look for. You notice how often shelter remains appear in clusters rather than isolation. This supports a historical fact that winter camps were rarely random. Cowboys returned to known survivable spots year after year. Memory-guided placement. Successful shelter locations became informal landmarks passed down between crews. Archaeology confirms what diaries hinted at. Dugouts leave the clearest marks. Slightly sunken rectangles, often oriented the same way relative to wind patterns. Soil analysis reveals ash and charcoal mixed deep into the earth, evidence of repeated fires. These weren't one-night shelters, they were winter commitments. Cowboys dug down only when they expected to stay. Sod shelters show up differently. Roots knit soil together long after walls collapse, creating dense patches that resist erosion. Archaeologists can sometimes trace sod, outlines by vegetation differences alone. Grass grows differently where sod once stood. Winter shelters altered ecosystems subtly but permanently. Rock shelters tell layered stories. Multiple hearths stacked through time. Different tool fragments mixed together. Evidence of shared use across cultures and eras. Cowboys didn't own these places. They borrowed them briefly, leaving marks among many others. Archaeology reveals winter as a shared human problem, not a single-era struggle. There's a quirky detail archaeologists often note. Broken glass and metal fragments embedded into shelter walls. These weren't accidents. Cowboys pressed scraps into mud or sod to strengthen surfaces or block drafts. What looks like trash now was deliberate reinforcement then. Winter repurposed debris into structure. You see how fire placement shows up archaeologically. Hearths near entrances. Ash deposits angled toward open sides. These patterns match written descriptions of winter fire strategy. Archaeology confirms that cowboys understood airflow even without scientific language. Shelter design left physical proof of mental models. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much shelter evidence we've lost. Many winter camps were erased by ploughing, development, or natural erosion. What remains likely represents only a fraction of what once existed. This absence skews interpretation. The shelters that survive archaeologically may not represent the most common ones, only the most durable. You think about canvas shelters and snow shelters, almost invisible to archaeology. They vanish completely, leaving only indirect signs, trampled ground, fire scars, displaced stone. Yet these shelters saved lives. Their absence from the record doesn't mean they were insignificant. Winter survival often leaves no monument. A fringe theory suggests some cowboys intentionally dismantled shelters thoroughly to avoid leaving traces that might attract others or predators. While hard to prove, the scarcity of intact structures supports the idea. Shelters were tools, not legacies. Once winter passed, they lost purpose. You notice how artifacts cluster around entrances. Buttons, cartridge casings, broken tools. People dropped things where they paused most often. Archaeologists read these clusters like footnotes. They show how shelters were used, where people gathered, where they hesitated before stepping back into the cold. There's a historical fact tied to abandoned winter camps that often surprises people. Many were reused decades later by completely different groups: sheep herders, trappers, even early motorists. Shelter knowledge persisted physically. One generation's winter solution became the next generation's starting point. You feel the weight of time in these quiet places. Shelters once held breath, heat, fear, and relief. Now they hold only absence. But that absence still speaks. It tells you where winter was beaten just enough to let men continue. Archaeology also reveals failures. Collapsed roofs, hearths sealed under snow layers, vents blocked permanently. These sites often show abrupt abandonment. Winter didn't always allow second chances. Some shelters became graves, though names were lost. There's debate among scholars about whether these failed shelters were poorly designed or simply overwhelmed. Evidence suggests many were well built for average winters. Extreme events exceeded their limits. Archaeology reminds us that success and failure sometimes differ only by degrees. You stand in a shallow depression, imagining walls rising again, hides stretched tight, snow banked high. The land remembers even when people forget. Cowboy winter shelters weren't meant to last, but traces of their struggle remain etched into soil and stone. In the Old West, shelter was temporary, but survival was cumulative. Each winter left marks, on land, on memory, on methods. Archaeology connects those marks across time, reminding us that endurance doesn't always announce itself loudly. As you move on, the ground levels out again, hiding its history beneath grass and dust. But you know now how to see it. Winter survival left fingerprints everywhere. You just have to slow down enough to notice where men once held their ground against the cold, built something fragile, and trusted it to last the night. You step back from the details now and see the larger shape of it all. Cowboy winter shelters weren't footnotes to Western history. They were foundations. Without them, the cattle industry collapses, trail drives end early, and the myth of the open range never survives long enough to be written down. Winter decided what endured, and shelter was how men negotiated with that decision. Every design choice carried forward. Low profiles became standard. Line camps grew sturdier. Seasonal planning shifted around winter realities instead of ignoring them. That's a historical fact reflected in how ranching infrastructure evolved after repeated hard winters. Shelters shaped schedules, routes, and even economics. Winter survival wasn't separate from the Old West. It defined it. You realise that cowboy shelters quietly influenced settlement patterns too. Camps that survived winters often became permanent sites later. Roads followed them. Towns grew nearby. What began as a brush wall against wind sometimes became a dot on a map. Shelter left fingerprints on geography. There's a quirky but telling detail here. Some early western towns began as winterline camps because they were already proven survivable locations. Reliable shelter sites attracted people. People attracted trade. Trade attracted permanence. Winter filtered where civilization could take hold. The legacy also lives in modern survival knowledge. Many principles taught today, wind management, insulation layering, site selection, echo cowboy winter practices directly. They weren't invented in classrooms. They were learned by freezing men, making mistakes. Shelter wisdom passed forward quietly, often stripped of its original context. You see this legacy in language too. Phrases like batten down, hole up, and ride out the storm come from lived shelter experiences. Winter vocabulary grew out of necessity. Cowboys didn't coin metaphors for poetry. They coined them to explain survival. There's ongoing debate among historians about whether cowboy winter survival was exceptional or merely adequate. Some argue many survived despite poor preparation. Others point out that adaptation improved steadily. Shelter evidence suggests growth. Cowboys learned. Slowly, painfully, but effectively. You think about how rarely shelters appear in popular Western stories. Guns, horses, and horizons dominate. Walls and roofs stay off stage. That omission matters. It hides the truth that survival depended less on courage and more on patience, planning, and humility before weather. There's a historical fact that reframes everything. More cowboys died from exposure and illness than from violence. Shelters weren't background details. They were the primary defense against the greatest threat. Ignoring them distorts the story of the West. You reflect on how shelter forced collaboration. Men who competed all summer shared labor in winter. Skills spread, knowledge pooled. Winter turned individualism into interdependence, at least temporarily. That cooperation shaped cowboy culture more than myths admit. A fringe but fascinating idea suggests that winter shelter practices softened frontier violence by forcing men into close quarters and shared vulnerability. While hard to prove, winter camps did create moments of enforced peace. Survival left little energy for conflict. You notice how shelters embodied a philosophy: adapt instead of dominate. Cowboys didn't conquer winter. They learned to fit inside its margins. That mindset contrasts sharply with later industrial approaches to the land. Shelter represented coexistence rather than control. The legacy extends beyond cowboys. Trappers, sheep herders, surveyors, and early motorists borrowed these shelter strategies. Winter didn't discriminate by occupation. Solutions spread wherever cold followed people west. You feel a quiet respect settle in. These shelters were never meant to be admired. They were meant to disappear once they'd done their job. But their impact lingered. They shaped who stayed, who left, and who lasted. There's debate about whether modern people could replicate these shelters successfully today. Tools and materials are different, but conditions remain. Cold, wind, snow, and darkness haven't changed. The principles still work. Winter still responds to the same physics. You imagine standing in a modern storm with nothing but land and limited supplies. Suddenly, the old shelters don't feel primitive. They feel precise. Every choice refined by failure. Every wall shaped by memory. As you let the story settle, you understand something important. Cowboy winter shelters weren't just structures. They were conversations with the land, responses shaped by listening, adjusting, and trying again. That conversation continues wherever people face harsh conditions without guarantees. In the Old West, survival didn't come from bravado. It came from building something imperfect and trusting it enough to sleep, night after night, storm after storm, winter after winter. And as you drift toward rest now, wrapped in the quiet knowledge of how much effort once went into surviving a single cold night, you realize why these shelters matter. They remind you that history isn't only made in moments of action. Sometimes it's made in stillness, inside low walls under banked snow, listening to the wind fail to get through. You've travelled a long way tonight, farther than maps usually show. Not across miles, but across decisions made quietly in the dark. Decisions that kept men breathing through winters that didn't care if they were brave, skilled, or tired. As the story settles, you're left with something calmer than facts and heavier than myth, an understanding of how thin the line between survival and disappearance really was. You can almost feel it now, the way a shelter changes your breathing, how the world narrows just enough to make rest possible. The Old West wasn't built only by motion and noise, it was built by stillness, by men crouched behind brush walls, tucked into earth, wrapped in hides, listening to the wind lose interest. Winter forced them to slow down, to think smaller, to accept limits. And in doing so, it shaped a culture that learned endurance long before it learned legends. What stays with you most isn't the ingenuity, impressive as it was, it's the humility. Cowboy shelters weren't declarations of dominance over nature. They were acknowledgements of vulnerability, quiet admissions that survival required cooperation, with the land, with weather, with other people, and sometimes with ideas borrowed from those who had survived here longer. As you drift towards sleep, the details blur in a comforting way. Sod walls soften into earth. Canvas flaps quiet down. Fires settle into coals. Snowbanks press gently instead of threateningly. The shelters hold, not perfectly, not permanently, but long enough. Long enough was always the goal. And maybe that's the part worth carrying forward. You don't need perfect conditions, perfect plans, or perfect strength. You need awareness, adjustment, and the willingness to build something modest that works for now. Winter teaches that lesson patiently, over and over, to anyone willing to listen. So as the night deepens around you, imagine yourself inside one of those shelters, low, sturdy, imperfect, but holding. The wind is out there somewhere, still moving, still cold, still unconcerned, but it's not inside with you, and that's enough.